Bom dia a todos e todas, sejam muito bem-vindos ao segundo Simpósio Internacional de Saúde Única e quarto Simpósio Paranaense de Saúde Única, Água, o Sangue da Terra. Hoje iniciaremos com o nosso segundo dia com o módulo Resistência aos antimicrobianos e suas interfaces. Meu nome é Jéssica Caia Lopes, sou médica veterinária, membro da Comissão Estadual de Saúde Única do Conselho Regional de Medicina Veterinária do Paraná e serei a moderadora do módulo. Antes de iniciar, queria passar para vocês algumas informações referentes à grade horária. Tivemos ajustes que está sendo projetado para vocês. E aproveito para informar que essa introdução, né, as notas de abertura serão realizadas em inglês, né, devido aos participantes aos nossos palestrantes que estarão nos acompanhando. E gostaria também de agradecer por toda a organização, por toda a equipação, agradecer ao Conselho Federal de Medicina Veterinária e ao Conselho Regional de Medicina Veterinária do Paraná também, para a gente estar mais uma vez aqui realizando esse evento com vocês. Então, sem mais delongas, first of all, I would like to take you on a trip, and this trip is going to be from the space to the deepest part of the ocean, and we will go through one of the world's most tricky problems we have been facing nowadays. But before I start, I would like to give a Brazilian touch to recall a little bit this classic MPB, Brazilian popular music song, created and written by Guilherme Arantes, and dating the 80s. Just a side note, I wasn't even born yet by that time, but Terra, Planeta, Água. And that matches exactly with the topic and the theme of this year's symposium. And hopefully you will be able to get a little bit more understanding of this relationship of antimicrobial resistance and water. So the World Health Organization has mentioned that antimicrobial resistance is a global problem for human health, animal health, and environmental health. And they do have a really, really big reason to say that. I will start with this picture. This is actually one of my favorite pictures that I am a really big fan of, and this is exactly to show how the One Health concept is integrated in the whole system that we live in, the environment, and how it's related to human health and how it's related to animal health and animal productions. And if you can take a look, you will see that we have a lot of red dots, and all these red dots, they are antimicrobials, rather in residues or rather like in the small particles. And you see that they are, and when we say everywhere, that means that we also have water everywhere. And for a first moment, I was thinking that the only place that we did not have red dots was in the sky or in the space. As you can see, they do not have red dots in the picture. And this is actually where I would like to take you first. So going to the space, to the galaxy and the universe. And I thought, well, we don't have antibiotics here, so we probably won't have antimicrobial resistance. But then NASA, the people that decided to send people to the space, they also identified antibiotic resistant bacteria in the space. So I was like, yes, probably we need to adjust the picture. And thanks to NASA, just a curiosity, they do have a microbiology research branch, and they are investigating antimicrobial resistance in the space too. So I made adjustments to the picture, and now we do have red dots in the space and in the sky. And this is exactly food for thoughts. What is our role in all this chain? Like, so one of the topics that is going to be approached today, and it's what is our role? How do we deal with antimicrobial resistance? How do we deal with antimicrobial use, misuse, overuse, and how do we participate and engage on this thematic? Because it's just not a matter of understanding microbiology, it's also a behavioral change that we need to look for. Where do we take this data from? Data regarding antimicrobial use, antimicrobial resistance is still a lot to be done. And then going to a very distinct and, let's say, opposite direction, I'm taking you now to the deep side of the ocean. Just a curiosity, so the real deep ocean, it's less known or explored than the surface of Mars, the planet Mars. And basically, this is another call for this specific point. So we have two distinct phrases here, and one of them is dilution is not the solution to pollution, and the other one is right the opposite. The best solution of pollution is dilution. And this is basically for us to think about all the impacts that we have in terms of the use of the residues of the water. Yesterday we had a module that was really pointing that out, and how we are behaving. So this is just to brainstorm, because we will also be discussing this during over the module, and just think about it and bear in mind that we have three distinct words that are just being positioned, that they have different positions in a sentence. And that makes a lot of difference. So thinking about all of the antimicrobial residues and all of the other things that we throw and that we hide in the deep part of the ocean. Maybe taking that into consideration and bringing back Sid from the Ice Age, we are going to live or we are going to die. And thinking about the context of this of antimicrobial resistance at the global level, and just giving you food for thoughts. And I hope you enjoyed the module. And now, without further ado, I will introduce our first speaker. So I would like to welcome Dr. Jane Heller. Jane Heller is an associate professor in veterinary epidemiology and public health at the School of Animal and Veterinary Sciences at Charles Sturt University. Jane's research focuses on infectious disease epidemiology, with particular reference to antimicrobial resistant organisms and the potential for zoonotic transfer of pathogens between animals and humans. Jane, the floor is yours. Welcome, and thank you very much for being here today. Just a side note, Jane is in Australia at this moment, and it's over 11 p.m. there. So really big thanks for being here.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Jessica. Now, I'm hoping that you can see my screen. Is that good? That's up nicely. So yes, as Jessica has said, it is after 11 o'clock at night, so please excuse the bags under my eyes, and hopefully you won't be able to tell that it's past my bedtime. So today I'm going to be talking about antimicrobial stewardship and behaviour change, and just give a little bit of insight into the experience that we have had in Australia and that we continue to have in Australia, and a little bit of the work that we have done in this area in recent times. So I'll go through a little bit of a background, talk about antimicrobial resistance in Australia across human and animal health, just a very broad overview. What we've been doing here, and we'll talk about antimicrobial stewardship in Australia, behaviour change and antimicrobial stewardship, and then where to from here. So to start off, here's a map, and it's a very basic map, but just to remind you that Australia, although it is very out of the way and it's not heard of very often in the international news, it's quite a large country, and we do sit quite out of the way, but we do have very much very similar issues to the rest of the world, and there are a lot of work on antimicrobial stewardship that is going on in Australia that is similar to the rest of the world, with its own unique sort of flavour. Now I've put this slide in, which is absolutely nothing other than just to set the scene and to remind us of what we're dealing with. And this is one of my favourite sets of quotes from quite a while ago now, so 10 years ago, but just to remind us that they are the most adaptable organisms on Earth, and that it is no surprise that when antimicrobials are faced with a barrage of imicable chemicals, that is antibiotics, that they have responded with an equal and opposite force. So we're up against quite a formidable foe when we're dealing with antimicrobial resistance. So with respect to antimicrobial resistance in Australia, what's the history? So we started off a long time ago, and we can be really proud of this. In 1999, Australia produced a report by the Joint Expert Advisory Committee on Antimicrobial Resistance. It was called the JEDICA report. It was incredibly thorough, and it produced a number of really specific recommendations around how we could deal with this growing threat of antimicrobial resistance. And in 1999, to produce such a report, we really were on the leading edge of thinking about antimicrobial resistance and dealing with antimicrobial resistance. Unfortunately, the next number of years, so the next 13 years between 1999 and 2012, this is pretty much what it looked like in terms of antimicrobial resistance work, and that is everything: research, any form of conversations around it even in Australia. It really died off, and bar 2 reports being published, there really was nothing else going on, which is a terrible shame, and unfortunately really put Australia on the back foot then at that time. In 2013, there was a Senate report or an inquiry into the progress, into the implementation of the recommendations of the 1999 JEDICA report. So it got to the level of government to say, well, look, what's happening? There's this report that has been done, and then nothing has eventuated from it in the last 13 years. So really after 2013, when this occurred, when this committee convened, that's when things started kicking off again in Australia. And so I'm pleased to say that since that time, we have actually had a true One Health approach. And in 2015, we had the release of the National Antimicrobial Resistance Strategy, which obviously was to guide Australia's response to the threat of antimicrobial misuse and resistance. This national strategy was fairly broad, and really was a bit like a bit of a plan, a little bit of a roadmap that wasn't at all specific, and it didn't really give us much of a guidance, but it was a plan. It was a start. In 2016, we then had an implementation plan. So it was sort of a plan around a plan in order to support the national strategy. But very luckily, we've actually had a second strategy that has been released just this year, which is far more specific and also includes environmental issues as well, which is really, really obviously very important. This is the breakdown of that plan, and you can see here we have a number of different things. So we're talking about clear governance for antimicrobial resistance initiative, prevention of and control of infection, engagement in the combat against resistance, appropriate use and stewardship practices, integrated surveillance and response, collaborative research agenda, and strengthen global collaboration and partnerships, which move across all of these. Now, what I'm predominantly going to be talking about today, and I'll just highlight to you as being part of the plan, is stewardship practices and appropriate use of antimicrobials. And just for anyone who isn't across the word stewardship, and this is important because my understanding from Jessica is that there isn't necessarily an equivalent word in some languages, and I'm incredibly ignorant ignorant, only knowing one language, so I'm sorry about that. But I thought it important to go over that definition so that we are all on the same space moving forward. And this is what I think is the nicest definition that I have seen, which is accepting responsibility for taking care of a valuable resource, that is antibiotics, that belongs to others. So it's saying we are stewards of something that is not ours. It's ours to use at this point in time, but it's the resource actually belongs to those who come after us. And I think that's a really nice way of looking at this type of thing. Okay, so we've got the national strategy, but what else is Australia doing? Well, in the human sector, we've got the development of reports on antimicrobial use and resistance within the human health setting. So they're called the AURA reports, and they were established as a baseline for antimicrobial resistance and usage in human health. And they're really fantastic because they do look at where antibiotics are used, where they're overused. They give us a really clear baseline for what's going on. We can see the types of antibiotics that are used in which sectors. In animals, however, we don't have an equivalent report. We certainly don't have one that is published each year. What we did have was a very general overarching report. It was a thorough report that was done a number of years ago now, and it would have been around 2016, that is looking at surveillance and reporting of antimicrobial resistance and usage in animals and agriculture in Australia. Unfortunately, there are no yearly reports, and so we don't know how we are keeping up and what is going on year by year as the human sector does, but we do have a little bit of baseline usage. So as we know, there was a global action plan on antimicrobial resistance that was endorsed by the WHO in 2015 with 5 strategic objectives. So those are the objectives. And it was a tripartite plan. And they urged, within this plan, that was all the member states were urged to complete national action plans by 2017 in alignment with the global action plan. So in Australia, we're pretty happy that we've done that. We've really ticked that box. We've come up with a plan, and we've even come up with a second plan. So that's really, really good. What we need to do is to look at ourselves in Australia amongst the big picture, and it's important that we set ourselves within the global context. We have to do this because we know, as everyone knows, that globalisation increases vulnerability. So although we can act on our own to increase our strategies around antimicrobial resistance, we can't actually adequately provide protection by acting alone. And this has been seen really, really recently, obviously, with the coronavirus epidemic, that no matter what each country does, they're still at the mercy of what other countries do as well. And that's really, really important with infectious disease. And obviously, antimicrobial resistance is linked with infectious disease. We often call ourselves in Australia the lucky country. And with respect to antimicrobial resistance, I'd like to say that Australia is lucky. We don't have any over-the-counter sales, which is just fantastic. We rely on prescription sales. We have good manufacturing practice. We have adequate drug activity. We know how much drug activity is in each of our drugs. We don't have any counterfeit circulating in Australia. We're also the beneficiaries of really good prior decisions. So we don't have any fluoroquinolone use in production animal species, and our Veterinary Medicines Association withdrew the use of avaparicin in any animal species in 2006. So again, we've had some good decisions. There are other decisions that we could have made that may have been better, but we do have those good baseline decisions. We also have good regulation and oversight, generally speaking, and we have a low baseline resistance, which we know across both humans and animals. And that's largely in light of those decisions that have been made, and particularly with respect to fluoroquinolone use in production animals. We have very little, if any, fluoroquinolone resistance in those species. So, as I said, the national response is a true One Health approach that, insofar as it crosses human and animal health. Okay, so we have, within the Australian government, we have departments of human health, and we have departments for agriculture, which also crosses water and environmental health to some degree. And so we know that it's a One Health problem, and these are snapshots from the website, our Australian government website, which clearly indicates that it is a One Health problem. So I think that's fantastic. It's a great starting point. Clearly there is far further that we could go, and we'll go into that in a minute. But at least Australia does recognise that antimicrobial resistance is a One Health problem, and it is seeking a solution through collaboration between human and animal health, which is a really, really great thing. All right. So what have we achieved with respect to antimicrobial resistance in animals in Australia? I've given you the oversight, I've given you the documents that have been published, but what have we actually achieved? Well, we do have movement towards consistency in laboratory testing and reporting across the animal labs in Australia. Now, note that I've said movement towards. We've got a little bit of traction. We've got a dedicated task force that is looking at this, and we've had a couple of publications and a couple of conferences around it, and certainly there is a will to move towards consistency in laboratory testing and reporting across all animal species, which is really, really wonderful. We also have firm baseline information. Like I said, we've got some really good documents in animal health and also in human health, so we know what's going on in animals, and also we can compare those to the humans. We also, and I think this is really important, we have buy-in from our national veterinary body. The Australian Veterinary Association has listed antimicrobial resistance as one of its 3 strategic priorities, and it really has been working towards trying to help. They have partnered with a number of different agencies, so the Department of Agriculture and also a number of different industries to produce antibiotic prescribing guidelines. So we've got a number of those that have been produced by the Australian Veterinary Association. They've produced infection control and biosecurity guidelines. They've also put some funding into antimicrobial stewardship pilot studies, so to look to see what we can do in companion animal species and horses. And they also work hard on community engagement. So that's a real positive. What else do we have? Well, we have open discussions between industry bodies. Now, I mentioned this, and I don't know what it's like in other countries, but certainly in Australia, when I came back to Australia, I moved back to Australia in 2009, and certainly at that stage, we didn't have this. We did not have open discussion between industry bodies. We have a number of industry bodies in Australia that are fantastic. They support research, they support our industries incredibly well. They collect levy money from different industries and they use it in a way that is really positive. But when I came back to Australia in 2009, there was this incredible defensiveness around antimicrobial resistance, and many of the industries were saying, well, it's not present in our industry. They weren't willing to look, so of course they weren't willing to find. But over the last 10 or more years, that defensiveness has just reduced and has diminished incredibly. These industries contribute to antimicrobial resistance research, even where there's not an obvious tangible benefit to them, and they have a really proactive approach. And that's been borne out with a conference that has been put together largely by our industry bodies, peak industry bodies in Australia, the first of which was run in 2018 and the second of which was planned for pretty much now, but will now be held in 2021 instead. So I think this is a really positive thing in Australia because of course we can't move forward without that. We've also moved towards consistency in teaching, and this is something that I'll come back to in a minute, but the Department of Agriculture in Australia and also the veterinary schools of Australia and New Zealand have funded an antimicrobial stewardship training program. Now, this program consists of a number of modules. It was put together by representatives from each of the veterinary schools throughout Australia and New Zealand, and I think we can be really proud of what we've produced. It's a fantastic online program. It covers off on all of the important aspects of antimicrobial resistance and antimicrobial stewardship, and it's available free to all veterinarians and undergraduate students in Australia and New Zealand. I will come back to that in a minute. This is a really important point, so please remember that. So there are the things that we've done well and that we've got, but there's always the question, what are we missing? Well, what we're missing in Australia is coordinated surveillance. We just don't have it. We don't have it individually and we don't have it in a One Health sense. We do have movement towards surveillance in food animals, but we're not quite there yet. We have data, baseline data, and we have an expert task group that has been formed that looks at pigs and chickens, and we are in discussions with other industries, but we are not quite there. We also don't have great information on usage. There's currently no way of identifying usage or prescribing across different species. We can't identify critically important antimicrobial use in different industries, which is super important. So we don't know which industries are using which drugs and which of those are using drugs that we should be reserving for human health. We also, this is really important, I said we don't have over-the-counter sales, but we do have compounding pharmacies, and they can potentially throw a spanner in the works because you can miss out on prescribing data, and we don't understand their contribution as yet. We're getting there. What we do have, unfortunately, is anecdotal evidence of excess use of third-generation cephalosporins in a couple of industries, but again, we can't corroborate that because we don't have really good usage data. The next part, this next question, what are we missing in terms of antimicrobial stewardship, is, I think, is where we're moving with respect to talking within this talk. And it's very, very important for us to address that. What are we missing? What are we missing in terms of how we use our antibiotics? Well, I think we're missing a depth of understanding of antimicrobial stewardship principles at the coalface. So by coalface, I mean those people who are prescribing antibiotics, veterinarians, doctors, and dentists in particular. If we're thinking about just animal industries, then obviously we're thinking about veterinarians, but also farmers who are engaging veterinarians as well, but really importantly the vets who are needing to actually prescribe. We're unsure if they've had access to appropriate education. I think probably we haven't done a great job of educating people within universities, and I can say that because I work at a university. And I wonder whether people really feel empowered to actually make the move back to the older, more narrow spectrum drugs in the absence of really solid education and support. In addition to this, we don't have established frameworks within which individual practices can develop protocols. And I think this speaks to the previous point. If we have an established framework and can develop protocols through that framework, then it's much easier to identify when and where we should use those older narrow spectrum drugs and the drugs that we might not be so confident in reaching for, but are better with respect to stewardship. We also do not have solutions in terms of the complex interaction between animal health and economics. And I've got a picture here of a pig farm, and this is just any old pig farm. But I've got a beautiful story of finding some really significant, and when I say significant, I mean significant for human health, antimicrobial resistance in pigs on a pig farm that is owned by a small business, a family business. And in order for us to actually address that antimicrobial resistance, which actually wasn't doing anything to the pigs, it was going to cost them a huge amount of money. Now, where does that money come from? It comes from the individuals. It comes from those people who own those environments, who own those businesses, but they don't see the benefit of doing that. The benefit is for the greater good. It's for 20 years down the track, perhaps. It's for those people in hospital. It's for their staff members. It's for the staff members' families. And that is really, really important, that we have to address that. And we haven't done that. The conversation, we're not even close to that conversation in Australia, and I think probably elsewhere in the world as well. We also need to think about how we provide incentives, and that speaks to the previous comment. We know there's a complex interaction, so how do we incentivise people to do the right thing where actually they're not going to necessarily benefit from it? A very important thing. And I think we also are missing a clear understanding of what prescribers need. I think we have a very good understanding of what we think they need, but I don't think we've necessarily asked prescribers what it is that they need in order for them to engage better with antimicrobial stewardship. Now, I noticed that that Jessica in the initial presentation threw out the word wicked, and she was referring to antimicrobial resistance as a wicked problem, and I absolutely 100% agree. And I think we need to think about how we engage with antimicrobial stewardship and antimicrobial resistance from the view of seeing it as a wicked problem. Now, Mark Shipp, who is our Chief Veterinary Officer in Australia, has a quote. He published a paper, and he's been quoted in a number of publications and talks, saying that antimicrobial resistance is a typical wicked problem for which there is no single action alone that is sufficient to tackle it. Furthermore, any action may have unavoidable negative consequences for other stakeholders. This means that coordinated, collaborative, cross-sectorial action is essential. So, how do we solve wicked problems? This is just a little excerpt from an article in The Conversation, which is an evidence-based paper that we have in Australia that is looks at research and puts research into words that the general public might be able to engage with a little bit easier. And they identify that wicked problems are issues so complex and dependent on so many factors that it is hard to grasp what exactly the problem is or how to tackle it. And I think obviously that is what we're dealing with when we think about antimicrobial resistance and also antimicrobial stewardship on top of that. They're like a tangled mess of thread, hence the picture here. It's difficult to know which to pull first. And I think anyone who's ever tried to untangle a mess of thread knows that sometimes when you pull on one thread, it tightens up all of the others. And other times you might pull in a different one and it actually unravels everything. So it's a great analogy, and I think one that we need to keep in mind when we're thinking about antimicrobial resistance and stewardship. So let's go back to Australia's newest strategy, and let's think about stewardship within that strategy. So we've got a specific reference to appropriate usage and stewardship practices, but we've also got these 2 points here: infection prevention and control and greater engagement, which both really speak to stewardship as well. So keeping all of this in mind, we're thinking about the wickedness of our problem. We're thinking about our overarching antimicrobial resistance plan in Australia and strategy. If we think about our strategy as an umbrella, our national strategy as an umbrella, and thinking about what we're talking about stewardship, and we look at all of the things that we have under it, we want to ask ourselves, well, what is it that we have to do here? What is it that we need to do and to combine to speak to that national strategy, to do what seems so simple? We've got them written down here. We just need to have appropriate usage and stewardship practices. It sounds easy, but what is it that we actually need under here? Well, in Australia, we currently have a whole load of things. We've got websites. This is the University of Melbourne. They've got a fantastic website with a whole load of different stewardship resources on it. We've got prescribing guidelines across pretty much all species now, and if we haven't got them, they are coming. We've got a really great set of resources, almost too many, which I'll come back to in a minute. We've also had the development of our online program, which I told you about before. We've even published on it. There's a lot of resources available. In human health, the same. We've got antimicrobial stewardship programs in all hospitals. We've got really serious governance in the hospital setting. We've got antimicrobial stewardship committees. We've got the engagement of infectious disease physicians, and we've got a similar or greater level of antimicrobial stewardship guidelines available in hospital for use in hospital settings. A little bit different in the general practice environment, but we've got great resources. We've got a whole load of resources. We've got a lot of publications. We've got a lot of information around there. I'll come back to the nudge versus superbugs in a minute, but a heap of information. So what's going on with that? We've got numerous effective antimicrobial stewardship resources in both animal and human health. But the question is, what's actually happening on the front line? Are we using these resources? And if not, why not? Here we've got a number of different professionals. We've got veterinarians, we've got medicos, we've got dentists. And we're wondering whether they are actually using the resources. And I'm here to tell you pretty much they're not necessarily. So we need to figure out why. What is it that is restricting the use of those resources? Well, we've got a beautiful paper that identifies barriers to and enablers of implementing antimicrobial stewardship programs. And they identify in animal health that the key barriers were a lack of AMS governance structures. So that's not a problem in human health, but it certainly is in animal health. We have overarching client expectations. We have competition between practices, costs of microbiological testing, lack of access to education, training, and antimicrobial stewardship resources. There were some enablers, so that was concern for the role of the veterinary antimicrobial use in development of antimicrobial resistance in humans, and a sense of pride in the service provided and preparedness to change prescribing practices. So they're prepared to change potentially, but they're not doing it. Another beautiful paper that has been published identifies something that I think speaks really heavily to these barriers, and it identifies an externalisation of responsibilities. So this paper looks at antibiotic prescribing through a One Health approach, so looks at the results of a comparative survey across doctors, dentists and veterinarians. And what it finds is that actually these sets of individuals, they're not working together. They're actually asking, well, what is the other person doing? What the vets are saying, what are the medical people doing? And the medical people are saying, what are the vets doing? They're thinking the role of the prescribers in the other profession is clearly important, more important than mine, and therefore they are not making an effort to change. They are not engaging with the resources that they have available to them because they think someone else should be doing it. In addition to this, there's also a disconnect between governance and action. Where we've got governance, we have people with a big stick saying, you must do this, you must tick these boxes. And that very rarely leads to effective action. There's not necessarily enough carrots, a little bit too much stick, but even when there are carrots, we're not necessarily getting those carrots right because we are really finding that there is a lack of action that is associated with that governance structure. So our question is, how can we increase engagement with antimicrobial stewardship principles? We want to tackle externalisation. We want to bring people together. We want to tackle resistance to a top-down approach. So we want to have action from the bottom. We want our prescribers to be able to actually engage with the approach rather than see it as something that is rained down on them and that is required, that they are required to do. And we want to tackle the lack of engagement and action at the coalface, which is what all of these things, if we tackle externalisation and the resistance to a top-down approach, will ultimately do, but we also want to look at that specifically. So back to our wicked problem. We've talked about wicked problems, but we haven't really pulled them apart. And here's a lovely graphic that I found that identifies a number of different things that contribute to wicked problems. They're difficult to define. There are interdependencies and they're multi-causal. Yep, both of those things, that absolutely work for us. The solutions can lead to unforeseen consequences. Absolutely. We might use less antibiotics, but more of heavy metals or something else that also contributes to resistance. There is no clear solution. We don't really know whether we can get a solution here. It's socially complex. Yes, it is. We have just talked about that disconnect between different prescribers, and we haven't even brought in our end users yet. We haven't even brought in our patients and our clients. It involves changing behaviour, and they sit astride organisational boundaries and responsibilities. And it's seemingly intractable with chronic policy failure. All of these things really speak to what we're talking about. Now, when we're talking about wicked problems, we don't want to just say, yes, that's a wicked problem, let's move on. What we also need to address and to understand is that complex problems can vary, and they do vary in the extent of their wickedness. Now, it's an ugly table here, or an ugly graph, I should say. But what I want to make clear here, what I want us to look at is that very wicked problems, so the extent of wickedness, so the extremely wicked problems that sit up here in the top right-hand corner, they combine situations that have highly complex problems. So neither the problem or the solution is clear. And also increasing difficulty with respect to stakeholders and institutions. That is, multiple parties are present with conflicting values and interests. Excuse me. Now, both of these things are present with respect to antimicrobial resistance and also with respect to engagement with antimicrobial stewardship. We're not necessarily sure whether the problem or the solution is overly clear. And we do have multiple parties. We've talked about those multiple parties that span silos, so those in animal health and human health, but also within each of our silos, we have multiple parties with conflicting values and interests. We have veterinarians who are making money by prescribing. We have owners who they just want to get an animal better. They do not see the societal context. So there's a whole load of these things which is pushing our problem up the wickedness scale. Okay, so I'm pretty happy to say we have a very wicked problem. So then the next question is, well, how do we reduce the wickedness of this problem? Well, this is my view. We need to be informed by stakeholders. So that is those at the bottom, those people who are the users, the prescribers, the people who are the decision makers in this context. We need to respect the differences within and between professional groups. That is, we need to see the political complexity and not try to fix it, but just to respect it. There is a reason why people are not engaging. People who are in these professional contexts are incredibly valuable. They are experts in their field, and we must respect that. We must respect that there are differences and speak to those differences. So engage people in the way that they need to be engaged within that political complexity. We also need to invoke individual and collaborative processes, and we want to aim for inclusive participation across sectors. And unfortunately, I don't think I can draw on my screen here, but what we want to do is try to move this. We want to move that complexity down the scale where we have either the problem that's clear or both the problem and the solution that's clear. Okay, and we can look at various levels of resolution within that, but that's what we're aiming for. And we also want to reduce the difficulty with respect to stakeholders in institutions, and we want either cooperative or indifferent relationships. We need to reduce that scale as well, and if we can do both of those, then we can tame the wickedness of our problem. So how do we encourage this? How do we encourage behaviour change around antimicrobial stewardship to try to pull those two things down? Well, we can connect with and engage key stakeholders across prescribers in human and animal health to address the barriers. We can do this using appropriate social strategies that are identified by the stakeholders. Okay, so that's the really important thing. We go to the stakeholders and ask them how they would like to be engaged, not tell them how we think they would like to be engaged. And then use social marketing and behaviour change principles to connect stakeholders with existing resources. Because as I said before, we've got a whole load of resources. Our resources are not the issue. It's the connection between the individuals who potentially stand to benefit from them by using them and those resources. So how do we do this? Well, I'm going to talk about what we've started to do in a little area called Wagga Wagga, which is where I'm from, which is here, a dot halfway between Melbourne and Sydney on the map. And it's a great place, I think, to start looking at this because we have a veterinary school, we have a university, we have a large public hospital, a large private hospital, and a medical school. You can't get more One Health than that across those two units. Environmental health sits in the background for this one because we're talking specifically around prescribing across human and animal health. So we want to do the first thing. We want to connect with and engage key stakeholders across prescribers. And I'm going to talk firstly and give the example today around how we've done that in animal health in order to identify those strategies by the stakeholders. So this is the first group of our three groups that we're looking at. And we're going to look at a social strategy around veterinarians. So we're looking across different species and practice types within the veterinary industry. So the way we started was we engaged veterinarians in discussion around engagement with antimicrobial stewardship resources and training. We had 40 practicing veterinarians across a whole load of different areas, but within that Riverina region that I was telling you about. So within one geographical area that crossed a whole load of different species and types of practice. We sat down and spoke to them and we just let them talk. We developed focus group, we ran it very qualitatively. We talked with respect to the antimicrobial stewardship training program that had been developed because that was a tangible resource that we thought we wanted them to connect with. So we specifically asked them about that resource, whether they would connect with it, what was holding them back, what they thought they needed from a resource like that. None of them had connected with it, so it was a good example to give them. And then we used what we call the trans-theoretical model of behaviour change to classify our veterinarians and to look for commonalities across different groups. So it might be a little bit difficult. I'm sorry, this isn't the greatest picture here, but there are a number of different stages of change that we're aware of within this trans-theoretical model. The first is pre-contemplation. This is when someone is unaware of the behaviour or the need for change, or they're not planning to make a change. The next one is contemplation. This is where they are thinking about change. They are seeking out support and information, but they haven't yet made the change. Preparation is the next step, where they are planning to make the change. They're gathering confidence and resources. The next step is action, where they take positive steps to make the change and put plans into practice. And then finally, you have maintenance, where you achieve the results and the behaviour becomes part of daily life. So what we did is we took the first three of these because we knew that no one had taken the step, and we decided that we would analyse our data with respect to those three separate stages: pre-contemplation, contemplation, and preparation. And what we found among our focus groups was that the key messages that were coming from those people who were in the pre-contemplation stage, so remembering these people are not engaged and they don't necessarily want to be engaged, is it's not interesting, I don't care, and I'm too busy. So sorry, not going to do it. The second theme that came from here, or the second key message, was it's just not real to me. I don't see antimicrobial resistance. I don't have a problem with it. Therefore, it is not a real issue. So we'll come back to that in a minute. Those within the contemplation group said, I'd like to, but it's not easy. And, well, what's in it for me? What am I really going to get out of it? The preparation group didn't have anything in particular that was unique to them, but across all three of the groups, they all identified the barriers, and this is interesting. Certainly both of these have come up in the paper that I discussed previously. They've identified barriers that have said, my clients pressure me to give antibiotics. And secondly, it's not my fault. What about the others? That is externalization of the problem. So we looked for solutions and we asked them for solutions and we thought about solutions, and what we came up with respect to these particular themes and key messages, what we came up with is for the pre-contemplation group, they need to use platforms that are interesting and easy to engage with and that are potentially not focused on antimicrobial stewardship, that are giving them something else as well. They need us to avoid technical terms. They identified, this did not come from us, they identified that they may need jolting into caring. They need to see that it is actually real. And they require examples that are accessible and relevant. So that's really important information for us to take forward. Those within the contemplation group identified that the need to acknowledge that the issue is hard. They wanted to be seen. They wanted to see that it's not easy. We don't know everything. It's very hard to know everything. They wanted us to avoid shaming messaging. We needed to make sure that we didn't shame them into action. And they required evidence of good antimicrobial stewardship resulting in good patient outcomes. They needed to see something that was tangible to them. That is what's in it for me. Those that were prepared in the preparation stage, ready to go, they needed evidence that other practitioners are already engaging, first-hand experience of issues, and this is across all of them. They need to see that it's not just them that's engaging. They needed to feel connected to other prescribers and also to remind them why individual actions matter. So this was really, really important to them. So we've done that. We've connected with this group of individuals. Next, we want to try to use social marketing and behaviour change principles to connect stakeholders with existing resources. So how do we do that? Well, we're going to use Marketing 101. We've got our course. We want to think about understanding our target audience, seeing it from their perspective. We've already done that. We've engaged with them. We want to be clear about what we'd like our target audience to do. We can do that. We want to ensure that the benefits of doing what we'd like them to do outweighs the costs or barriers to doing it. And we want to use a combination of activities in order to encourage people to achieve the desired action. So we've gone about that by developing what we call the Antimicrobial Resistance Veterinary Collective. Now this exists in the form of a website, but what it is a system with the goals of building unity and understanding of antimicrobial resistance across our profession, and creating a single place for veterinarians and researchers to find relevant, up-to-date information about antimicrobial resistance and antimicrobial stewardship, and ultimately to connect those people with the resources that they need in a way that actually works for each individual group. So what does our antimicrobial resistance vet collective actually look like? Well, we wanted to try to make it so that it was going to work for each of our individuals and each of the people in the different groups. So those people that were ready to engage, those people who were maybe thinking about it, and those people that just didn't have any thoughts about it whatsoever. So myself and my two colleagues who developed this website took on 3 avatars. One of us took on the role of the pre-contemplator, another took on the role of the contemplator, and the third took on the role of the prepared, the person who was prepared and who was the stewardship champion within their clinic and wanted to know as much as they could so that they could be the best that they could be. They're 3 different people. And as we were developing the website with the knowledge that we had from those focus groups, we also challenged ourselves from the perspective of these 3 different avatars. And I got the best one. I got the pre-contemplator. So I could say, I don't care about that. Tell it to me in a different way. And it was actually quite a fun experience to do, but also very instructive because it made us realize just how much we make assumptions about what people want when we're putting together something that we think people need. So here are some frame shots of the website. The website is not up and ready to go yet, but it is in the development stage and it will be ready to go by the end of the year. So these are some screenshots and they're not the final version, but this is just to show, this is the home page. There's a whole load of information here, some quick links. We have a page that is specifically about antimicrobial resistance. What does it mean for the veterinary profession? We then used antimicrobial resistance examples because we wanted to make it tangible. We listened to what those pre-contemplators said. It needs to be something that's useful to them. So we actually made them examples that were specifically case studies that would be actually useful, that crossed a number of different species. We've then made access to the guidelines and given people information around how to utilise those guidelines. And we've also given them direct information around how to talk to clients, particular information around that, with a script and information that should be of tangible use for those people who are wishing to start up a conversation around antimicrobial resistance and stewardship. We then, because we have so many sets of guidelines that are in so many different places, we've pulled all our guidelines together and we've made a one-stop shop. So we are not reinventing the wheel. All we are doing is guiding people to the place that they can find the guidelines and setting them out in a way that is really easy to see so that they can see what's present, what's available, and where best to go to, rather than spending hours or as much time as you are willing to spend looking across Australian sites to see whether there are any sites for pocket pets. No, you can come down here and say, there are no specific guidelines in Australia, but here are some recommendations and others elsewhere. We have open access journal articles, so linking people to open access journal articles, and also some videos for diagnostic skills refreshers. So people can go on and have a look at how to do urine wet preps, sticky tape samples, and other things. They should be able to click the link very quickly and see what's going on. And we also have a quick link that takes us straight to our antimicrobial stewardship online program. Again, people don't have to go anywhere else to find it. They can click through here and get to it straight away. And then finally, we've got tangible resources for the practices. We've got information that should be very easily come up with, and some of those are things, that are posters that people can print out and put in their clinics that allow conversation to be started. So this is the final draft of the one that we have around companion animals, which we're hoping to get out very soon. In addition to this, and I haven't put it up, we will be developing, we are currently developing an online program, an online video that allows people to look to see an overview of antimicrobial stewardship. Essentially, we're using this social marketing approach to try to develop that online system to link people up with all of the resources that are already present. The additional thing that I haven't discussed here is how we will market this marketing program, and we'll do that through social media, through all of the ways that people have identified that they engage, and hopefully that will allow us to link people through very, very quickly. So in order for us to do that, to do all of the things that I've just discussed, we've used some really solid background research on behaviour change, and this is a really, if anyone's looking to read a really interesting book that is a very good read, Nudge is a great book to read in this area by Richard Thaler and Cass Sunstein. And this is a paper that was published by the Chief Health Officer, who put a project in place to try to use some of these principles to push human medical prescribers into prescribing less. All they did was they sent out a letter to all prescribers telling them where they sat in terms of their prescribing and giving them a distribution of everyone else in Australia. And they sent it to those people who were very high prescribers, who were over prescribing, and they watched that prescribing fall. So we're using these methods of nudging people into doing what we would like them to do. Finally, this is essentially just a work in progress. We're using Marketing 101 to try to influence people to come together with what we think are really good resources that were already present but not being engaged with. And we're hoping that we can extend this across sectors so we can move into GPs and hospital medics and dental practitioners, and to open up communication between groups. If we can manage to get a number of different websites that are set up in the same way, and hubs like the Antimicrobial Resistance Veterinary Collective, so that we can engage everyone across those different silos with conversations around engagement. So I'd just like to finally acknowledge my collaborators, Jackie Norris and Kelly Thomas, who have worked tirelessly on the Vet Collective website, Epi Interactive, who are doing our website building, and also our social marketing team, Dr. Felicity Small and Tahmed Naeem. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Jane, for bringing to us the Australian experience. I really enjoy this topic, and I think it's really interesting, and all the work that you have been doing in Australia and moving forward with this specific topic. It's really interesting. And I think that one of the biggest challenges we have with this specific situation is that we are mixing, and this is a really One Health situation, mixing sociological aspects and all the biological aspects behind the science. And I also know that this for us is a big challenge. So thanks for that. And maybe it would be interesting for you to elaborate. I know we are really short in time, and apologies for that. But maybe if you could touch a little bit on how we could actually, if we can, transfer that to the general population perspective on how we could, well, maybe move forward with behavioral change on this aspect, because we do have our professional side to work on that, and but we also need to spread the word and the knowledge. So if you could briefly just elaborate.
Yeah, it's a great question, and it's that's the one group that I didn't specifically talk about, and I think those people who are the end users are just as important to engage. And I think we have to go through a social marketing approach. I think we need an approach like we've had in Australia to, we had a social marketing approach around sunscreen, because it's, very important that we, that we have wear a hat and sun cream and a shirt. And so the social marketing approach that has been here for years and years and years is slip, slop, slap. And slip on a shirt, slop on some sunscreen, and slap on a hat. And it's so simple, but it's so effective. And I think what we need to do is be very careful with how we create an approach that we move to the general public. We need to bring them alongside us, and we need to be very careful that we don't disengage them before we engage them. And I think we need to really engage some very hefty marketing strategists to enable us to get some really solid messages that can be utilised, that sit across all domains, so that they understand it when they're going to the veterinarian, when they're going to the doctor, and when they're going to the dentist. And so, you know, they're not concerned when they're not given antibiotics. But I think we can do more harm than good if we go out too early with this. I think it has to be a coordinated approach. And, you know, we started off with grand plans of doing things across all of the different silos. Well, actually, we need to really engage one group of people first and then slowly spread out, because the risk of disengaging people by going too hard too fast is just a little bit too much.
Perfect, and I do agree with that. So Jane, thank you very much for being here with us today. We really appreciate the time, and also, you know, all the efforts to be just to be awake that late. And just big thanks, and it was really nice to see friendly faces by the end of the presentation.
Thanks very much. So, thanks, Jessica, and it's been lovely to be able to present.
Perfect, thank you. I'm glad that you had a good time with us too. I will take this moment to introduce our next speaker, Dr. David Speck-Snyder. So Dr. David, he works as a ruminant veterinarian and researcher at the Utrecht University in the Netherlands. His research projects are mostly focused on designing and testing interventions to promote prudent antimicrobial use practices of veterinarians and farmers, and are characterized by a multidisciplinary approach with a strong involvement of the social sciences. David is supervising several national and international PhD and master's students, and he's also involved in several research projects in the Netherlands, Indonesia, and Myanmar. And he's regularly involved in international consultancy missions related to antimicrobial stewardship in farm animals. So David, please be welcome, and thanks for being here with us today. And the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you very much, Jessica. Hopefully you can see my screen now.
Yes, we do. Okay,
good. And you can hear me loud and clearly?
Perfectly.
Okay, great. Well, thank you very much. Well, thank you for this invitation to speak on your symposium about antimicrobial stewardship in the Netherlands. This will be my outline. Well, thank you also for the introduction. Maybe a short history of myself. I graduated as a veterinarian in 2009 in Utrecht University in the Netherlands. Then I started working in a private veterinary clinic as a ruminant veterinarian. And in 2011, I returned partly back to the university to do a PhD. And from 2017 onwards, I'm working both as a veterinary practitioner in the university farm animal clinic, which is affiliated to the university. We do normal patient care, but we also teach veterinary students there, and we also have some field research going on there. And apart from that, I'm working as a senior researcher in the Department of Infectious Diseases and Immunology at the Faculty of Veterinary Medicine of Utrecht University. And my partner in crime is Professor Jaap Wagenaar, on whose behalf I also give this presentation. Well, we are currently amidst a huge pandemic, which affects almost every country in the world. And it's the COVID-19 pandemic, and we see that almost all governments are taking rigorous measures to control this COVID-19 pandemic. But in the meanwhile, there's a more silent pandemic going on, and that's the pandemic of antimicrobial resistance. And I'm sure you've had some similar kind of newspaper headings in your country. Every now and then it's in a newspaper. We know that antimicrobial resistance is a huge problem and is increasing. It's forecasted. This is a report published in 2016 by a UK economist, Dr. O'Neill, and it's called the AMR Review. And he has looked at the burden of disease and deaths due to antimicrobial resistant infections. And currently, around 700,000 people are dying each year globally due to antimicrobial resistant infections. But it's estimated that if we do nothing, that AMR in 2015 will cause about 10 million deaths per year on a global level. And to put it a little bit in perspective, I looked this morning and on the WHO website, COVID-19 over the last year has caused 1.2 million casualties. So I don't want to underestimate COVID-19, but I had to see it in perspective. If we do nothing about AMR, then it will really outweigh the number of deaths that have been caused by COVID-19 so far. A little bit background on antimicrobial resistance. We know there are trillions of bacteria on this globe, and because they multiply rapidly, every now and then a mutation appears, and some mutations they code for antimicrobial resistance. So when you have a population of bacteria, always you will have some resistant bacteria in this whole population of bacteria. But normally they cannot compete with the antimicrobial susceptible bacteria, so they don't do much harm. But if we apply antibiotics to this population of bacteria, what will happen is that most susceptible bacteria, so the yellow ones, they will die. But the resistant bacteria, the red ones, they will survive. So then they have more fitness to compete with the susceptible bacteria. And if we continue using antibiotics or antimicrobials, then we in this way select for antimicrobial resistant bacteria. So they will multiply and they will take over the susceptible ones. The same happens also when we apply antimicrobials to humans or to animals. Let's see this chicken on the left side. It's normally colonized in the normal flora. There are a lot of bacteria. Most of them are susceptible for antibiotics, and only a few, due to random mutations, could be resistant to antimicrobials. If we put this chicken under antibiotics, we will select for the resistant bacteria. So they will multiply and they will take over. So this is the selection process. If we have a poor infection control, then also the resistant bacteria, they can spread to other chickens in the flock, or even to other chickens in another flock in another farm. So when we're talking about antimicrobial resistance, two things are really important. It's the selection of resistant bacteria, but also the spread of resistant bacteria to other individuals. Bacteria, they can spread between animals or between humans, but most bacteria, they don't stick to one single host. So they can also jump over to other animals, or even from humans to animals, or from animals to humans. When we use antimicrobials in animals, we could select for resistant bacteria, and they can disseminate to humans via, for instance, via direct contact, but also via the food chain, so inappropriate cooking and processed food, but also via the environment. Think of feces, fertilizer, which comes into the environment, in surface water, people swim there. So those can be potential routes through which resistant bacteria can move from animals to humans. And they don't necessarily have to cause a disease there in the humans, but the resistant bacteria can spread into the community just by human-human transmission. And once they cause a disease in someone, they can get sick, they have to be admitted to hospital, and they cannot be treated anymore. But as you can see here, there's a very complex route from the animals, so overuse or misuse of antibiotics in the animals, to the hospitals, and that makes it so complex. How the routing and how the epidemiology is of resistance, antimicrobial resistance from animals to humans. Yep. And there is a lot of controversy about the use of antimicrobials in animals and how much it contributes to the antimicrobial resistance burden in humans. And as said before, the epidemiology is very complex. It's also mostly a very indirect route. So it's very hard and very complicated to specifically assess how much antimicrobial use in animals contributes to the AMR problem in humans. But what we do know is, and this is also from the AMR review, they've done a very systematic literature search, and they really found a lot of evidence that the use of antimicrobials in animals contributes to the antimicrobial resistance in humans. Although it's very hard to really assess the magnitude of the contribution, there is really a contribution. And in the Netherlands and in Europe, we often use the precautionary principle. So even when there is the evidence is not, let's say, conclusive, we think that there is enough evidence that antimicrobial use in animals contributes to the resistance problem in humans. So that's why we also target antimicrobial use in animals to fight the antimicrobial resistance in humans. And we know the more antimicrobials we use, whether it's in humans, whether it's in animals, whether it's in the environment, the faster we lose the war against antimicrobial resistance. So it's an increasing burden. And what also does not help is that the pipeline of new antibiotics is running off. We saw most new antibiotics, they have been discovered or invented in the 50s and the 60s of the last century. We have a couple of them in the beginning of this century, but at the moment there are only a few new antimicrobials in the pipeline, and if they will be marketed, they will be shelved and only reserved for people that cannot be treated with another antimicrobial, so they will really be used as a last resort. So we are quite in trouble here. So what should we do? We should contain, when we want to contain antimicrobial resistance, we should focus both on preventing the selection of resistant bacteria, but also preventing the spread of resistant bacteria. And we should do that within animals, within animal population, within human populations, but also in the environment and the jump over from animals to humans or via the environment. So this really needs a One Health approach. That's also mentioned by the former speaker. So what have we done in the Netherlands? And let me first zoom into the Netherlands. As you might know, the Netherlands is a very small country in Northwest Europe. But it's, I think, one of the most densely populated countries in the world, both when looking to the number of people living there and when you look to the number of animals living there. Here on the left side, you see the density of humans in this area. Well, this whole red area here is the Netherlands. When you look at the animal density in Europe, you also see that the Netherlands is, well, the most densely populated. And we have almost 4 million cattle, almost 12 million pigs, over 100,000 chickens, and a lot of other animals here. And we also live here with 17 million people. After the Second World War, we saw a rapid growth of the livestock sector in the Netherlands, a lot of intensification. So we have big farms here. And at the moment, we are a big exporter of agricultural products. Over 70% of what we produce here in the Netherlands is exported. And concurrently with that, we also saw a rapid growth of antimicrobial use. and in the livestock sectors, and we use them, of course, therapeutic to treat sick animals, but there was also a huge market for prophylactic or metaphylactic use, so that's really the preventive use, and also a lot of antimicrobials were used as growth promoters, although the use of antimicrobial growth promoters was banned in the whole of the European Union, so also in the Netherlands, between 1999 and 2006. In 2010, we had a couple of triggers which really triggered, or events which really triggered the policy in the Netherlands to reduce antimicrobial use in animals. We saw the emergence of resistant bacteria in livestock and their risk for transmission to humans. And then specifically, we are talking about the livestock-associated MRSA, so methicillin-resistant Staphylococcus aureus, but also on the ESBL-producing E. coli. We have had several events, and those events were also broadly disseminated in the newspapers, in the headlines. So the public became a bit aware of the problem of antimicrobial use and the risk of transmission of antimicrobial resistant bacteria from animals to humans. And so there was a growing concern about the possible human health implications of livestock production in the Netherlands. And as mentioned before, here we really favor the precautionary principle. Although the evidence was not conclusive, there was enough indication or enough evidence that there was at least a contribution to of antimicrobial use in livestock to antimicrobial resistance in people. So the primary motivation of our reduction policy was really in public health. What also did not help was the publication of two scientific papers in 2007 and 2008. There on the left, you see the antimicrobial use in humans, which was compared between different European countries. And here you can see that on the human side, the Netherlands was one of the lowest users of antimicrobials in humans. And that's because the human doctors in the Netherlands, they have been very restrictive in prescribing antimicrobials already for decades. So we were amongst the lowest users in the European Union. On the other side, and this is a paper of 2007, based on sales data in different European countries. This is on the animal side, and there we were amongst the highest users of antimicrobials in Europe. So there's a big discrepancy between the use in humans and the use in animals. And together with these events in which we saw some transmission from resistant bacteria from animals to humans, that really triggered the public opinion, but also the farmer organizations, the veterinarians, and those were really the triggers for a reduction policy here in the Netherlands. So this reduction policy, it was agreed upon in 2010, and that was an agreement between the government, between the livestock sectors and the veterinarians. And there was a clear targets were defined, and that was that we had to reduce antimicrobial use with 20% in 2011, up to 70% in 2015. And it was really a bottom-up approach in that sense that the government said, okay, you have to reduce with 70%, but it's up to you how you want to do it. So you can take your own measures, you can think of your own measures, and where necessary, we can back that with legislation, with surveillance, enforcement, whatever. But it's up to you to accomplish this target. So these targets were very strict. And another agreement which we made is that we would try to make all the antimicrobial use for each farm and each veterinarian transparent. To assist the surveillance of antimicrobial use. And we also agreed that we would introduce a benchmarking system for antimicrobial use within the different livestock sector for individual farmers and individual veterinarians. If I explain, often when I explain what we did in the Netherlands, I would like to do that based on the 5 R's of antimicrobial stewardship, because that's what we are doing and we're doing. And antimicrobial stewardship, there are different definitions on the market, but the OIE definition is, I think, a very nice one. And that means that antimicrobial stewardship is implementing practical measures to improve animal health and animal welfare, while preventing or reducing the selection, emergence, and spread of antimicrobial resistant bacteria in animals and in humans. And in this very nice book, Antimicrobial Therapy, they've introduced the 5 R's of antimicrobial stewardship. The first one is responsibility. It should be clear who is responsible for what. And when we are talking about antimicrobial use, we should reduce as much as possible. We should refine our antimicrobial therapies as much as possible. Where possible, we should also try to replace antimicrobial treatments with non-antimicrobial treatments. And we should, of course, also review our taken actions, if they are effective and what the consequences were. So to start with the first R, the first one is responsibility. What we introduced in 2012 was a one-on-one relationship. So that means that every farm has a contract with one specific veterinarian, and that veterinarian is responsible for the antimicrobial use on a farm. So a farmer is not allowed to buy antimicrobials today in practice number A and then tomorrow go to another practice. No, he has a contract with one specific veterinarian, and he can only procure antimicrobials from that specific veterinarian. Of course, he can shift to another veterinarian, but then he has to make a new contract with the new veterinarian. So that means that we have that there is a strong link between a veterinarian and a farmer. And the farmer, we also made him responsible for following prudent use directions from the veterinarian or from the label. And that's also being inspected by the government. What we introduced in 2014 is that all antibiotics are used by vet only. So in principle, antimicrobials may only be applied by a veterinarian. Now, in practice, that's not always practical. So what we did is we made an exception for such called first choice antibiotics. Now we'll come back to that later. If a farmer has a one-on-one relationship with a specific veterinarian, if they have a frequent farm inspection by the veterinarian, and when there is an annual evaluation of a such called farm health and treatment plan. And so a farmer may have antibiotics in stock to treat his own animals, but he needs to stick to certain protocols, and he must have regular visits by his own vet to inspect and check and evaluate the antimicrobial use on his farm. The second R is of reduction. What we did, and what I mentioned before, in 2006, we already banned the use of AGPs, the growth promoters, but we also banned the prophylactic and metaphylactic antimicrobial use practices in farm animals. That was done in 2013. So from that time onwards, it was prohibited to use preventively antimicrobials. So what we saw is that there was a major shift from flock treatments to individual treatments where possible. So in broilers, that's not really feasible, but in pigs and in veal calves and in cows, it's really feasible to individually treat only sick animals instead of just treating the whole flock or the whole herd. And what we really saw is that there is an increased focus on prevention. We saw a major uptake of preventive herd health advisory services by veterinarians. We saw a major increase in the uptake of vaccination, but also farmers invested in improvements in housing, in climate, in nutrition, better biosecurity practices, those things. And what we also did, and that was more on a nationwide basis, is that we have put extra efforts in the eradication or control of specific animal diseases. For instance, we are now quite busy trying to eradicate IBR and BVB in cattle, which are viral diseases that really suppress the immune system, so they potentially cause a lot of antimicrobial usage. What we also did is we installed an independent public-private institute, which is called the SDA, the Veterinary Medicines Institute. And their task was to set AMU targets for benchmarking and to collect AMU data from each specific farm and each specific individual veterinarian throughout the country. So what they are receiving all antimicrobial delivery data and animal data for over 40,000 livestock farms. And what they also do is publish annually a report about the antimicrobial use dynamics. How does that work? When I go to a farm and when I need to treat a sick cow, say I prescribe 1 bottle of penicillin. Every veterinarian in the Netherlands has a digital management system, or at least access to a computer. So what I do is when I prescribe a bottle of penicillin to a specific farm, I have to enter that into my management system because I also need to write a bill to this farmer. So I put it into my management system, and then I write down what I prescribe, 1 bottle of penicillin, to which farm, and each farm has a unique farm number. And I, as a veterinarian, I have my own specific unique veterinarian number. So I put it into my management system, and this management system is connected to different databases. We have nationwide databases for each major livestock sector, for poultry, for pigs, for veal cows, and for dairy. Well, I'm a dairy veterinarian, so in this case, this information that I prescribed 1 bottle of penicillin to this specific farm is automatically sent to the database of the dairy sector, and there it's being processed. And every year, they collect all the data, they process it, and they send these data to the SDA, which is the Veterinary Medicines Institute. So in this way, all the prescription data of all the farms and all the veterinarians are being collected in nationwide databases and are collected by this Veterinary Medicines Institute. Well, what are the outcomes of the data analysis by the SDA, the Veterinary Medicines Institute? That's we calculate defined daily dose animal, and that's more or less it's the average treatable weight according to the prescribed antimicrobials on an annual base, divided by the average amount of animals at risk for treatment. What we do is we monitor trends per animal sector, that's the DVA national. What we also do is we benchmark at individual farm level, that's the DVAF. And there we also set targets, so we say, okay, this is the threshold below where you should be related to your antimicrobial use. And what they do is to benchmark veterinarians. We used to have the VBI, Veterinary Benchmark Indicator. From this year onwards, it will be the DVA Vet. It's more or less a similar system, but it's also a benchmark system for veterinarians, including target setting. So how does it look like? This is, for instance, this was from 2012, and I thought it was from poultry. The SDA, for every livestock sector, they set threshold levels, and we discriminate between 3 different levels. And we want antimicrobial use as low as possible, so we have the target zone. So that's more or less the safe zone. So if you are below this threshold, you are in the target zone for antimicrobial use, and you don't have to take additional measures. Then we have the orange zone. We call this the signaling zone. This means that you're a little bit higher than the target zone, so that you should ideally take some measures to lower the antimicrobial use on your farm, or when you are a veterinarian, you should take measures to lower your prescription patterns. And then the action zone, that's the red zone. There, taking actions is not voluntary, but it's mandatory. So then the quality systems, they can enforce you to take additional measures to lower your antimicrobial use. So this is an overview of all the poultry farms in the Netherlands in 2012, and you see that there is a wide variation between the antimicrobial use on different farms. So on the y-axis you see the frequency of the farms, so the number of farms within this category. And you see that a lot of farms, they manage to have their antimicrobial use below the 10 DDDAs, but still there are some farms, and here some farms even go above 50. So these farms are in trouble in that sense that they have to take mandatory actions to reduce their antimicrobial use on their farms. So every farmer, they gets a regular AMU report from the livestock sector, and this is an example of an AMU report from a dairy farm. Here you can see the threshold for AMU on dairy farms is 6 DDDAs. So as a farmer, you should be below this 6 DDDAs. The green bar, that's the average, this is average antimicrobial use on this specific farm. And then the yellow bar is the national average. So here you can see that this farmer, he has 3.66 DDDAs is his AMU. Well, you can see that it's a bit higher than the average dairy farmer in the Netherlands. So, well, maybe he could take some additional measures to reduce his antimicrobial use. So this is the total amount of antimicrobials that he has used. And here in the corner, in the lower graph, you can here it's split divided between the application routes. And here you can probably identify, okay, you have a higher than average antimicrobial use. What can be the cause of that? And here it's divided between the application routes. So 1.14 is due to mastitis injectors, 1.53 is due to dry cow therapy, etc., etc. So when we have a farmer with a really high antimicrobial use, we can here do some more specific analysis and try to talk to the farmer. Okay, you have a higher than average antimicrobial use. I can see that you use twice as much mastitis injectors compared to your peer dairy farmers. What can be the reason for that, and how can we work on that to reduce it? Well, I as a veterinarian, I also get regular reports about my prescribing habits, and here you can see that in 2019 I had a lowering trend. At the beginning of 2019, I was close to the border of 0.10, but I was still in the target zone. But some veterinarians, they even go up to the red zone, so the action zone. So they should take mandatory measures to reduce their antimicrobial prescriptions. Well, the third R is the refinement of antimicrobial use. And what we did in the Netherlands is we reclassified the antimicrobials, and we updated our veterinary formularies. Well, our veterinary formularies, they exist already since 1995, and those are species-specific treatment guidelines. So they give guidance on which antimicrobial to use in a certain animal species for a certain disease. But what we also did is we reclassified the antimicrobial classes in the Netherlands. Formerly we had the small spectrum versus wide spectrum. Now we reclassified our antimicrobials based on the assumed risk on selection of ESBLs. And now our classification system is as follows. We classify antimicrobial classes as first choice. And that means that they are allowed for empiric therapy because we don't think there is a direct effect on ESBLs. Others are categorized as second choice antimicrobials. And then we say, well, we may still use them, but it's a no unless. And then we should have appropriate argumentation provided by a vet or substantiated by antibiotic or by bacterial culturing and sensitivity testing. And then we have the third choice antibiotics, and those are, for instance, fluoroquinolones and the third and fourth generation cephalosporins. We may still use them, but it's also a no unless. And then we have, we must underpin that really based on sensitivity testing. So I can only use the fluoroquinolone when sensitivity testing shows that no other antibiotic, or that the bacteria is not sensitive to any other antibiotic. And then we also have some antibiotics that are classified as banned, and we are not allowed to use them in food-producing animals. And then you can think of the carbapenems. We made an overall formulary or guidance, and here on the left side you can see all the antimicrobial classes that we have available in the Netherlands for veterinary use are listed here, and every antimicrobial is categorized here as first choice, those are the green ones, second choice, the yellow ones, third choice, the orange ones, or the red ones which are banned. So here I can easily see which antimicrobial is a first choice, is a second choice, and is a third choice. And we have copied this classification to the species-specific formularies or treatment guidelines. And here, for instance, this is the treatment guideline for pigs. And for instance, when you are confronted with a pig with enzootic pneumonia caused by Mycoplasma pneumoniae, you can see the first choice for parenteral treatment is thiamulin, tylosin, oxytetracycline. Well, if we really have to go to a second choice antibiotic, we can go to tulathromycin, lincomycin, etc. So this is how the system works. We have our overall guideline, and those guidances are translated into our species-specific guidelines, the formularies. What we also introduced in 2012 was the farm treatment plans. Every farm in the Netherlands should have a farm treatment plan, and that's a farm-specific treatment protocol, which describes the antimicrobial of choice for the most common animal diseases on that specific farm. At first, basically only first choice antibiotics are allowed on this farm treatment plan, and a farm treatment plan can look like this. You can see it on the right side. For clinical mastitis, the therapy of choice is Rimadyl, which is a non-steroid, and Avloxil, which is an amoxicillin containing injector. It describes the drug of choice, how it should be applied, the dosage, the frequency of treatment, how long the therapy should take, but also the withdrawal, the recommended withdrawal times. These farm-specific treatment protocols have to be evaluated at least annually and updated at least annually, together with the veterinarian. So we go to every farm at least once a year to do this annual evaluation. What we also introduced is, apart from the formularies, which are really antimicrobial treatment guidelines, we also developed as a veterinary association species-specific guidelines for good veterinary practice. And you can see them as professional standards for all the veterinarians in making certain veterinary policy decisions, also with decisional flowcharts. And they described how to diagnose the disease, what kind of treatments there are available, what the level of evidence is for those treatments, what the recommended treatment would be, but also recommendations on how to prevent disease. And one of the first ones that was published was the guideline Streptococcus suis in weaned piglets. And it contains these kinds of decision trees for veterinarians. And I'm not going to go into details here, but you start here at the beginning, and then you make all kinds of decisions whether or not to treat only a single animal, or whether you should go for flock therapy, what kind of diagnostics you should take to implement. And this can be very helpful for veterinarians to make good decisions and to make a good therapeutic plan. What we also did, what many veterinary practices did, is to organize workshops for their farmers on prudent antimicrobial use. There we collected, for instance, 10 farmers, and we instructed them how to read a label on a bottle of medicine or on veterinary drugs, how to calculate the right dose, where and how to apply a drug. And what we noticed is that many farmers, they were not really quite sure how to apply the drug. They just did something like they felt comfortable with, so we could instruct them how to properly use a drug and administer a drug. And it was really a practical session in the stable. So together we stand around the cow and pointed on where to inject the cow, how to inject the cow, how to estimate the weight of the cow, to calculate the dose, etc. What we also really see is a major increase in the uptake of diagnostics, both bacterial culturing and sensitivity testing, but we also see an increase in the use of animal site tests. For this, specific test is for calf scars, so diarrhea. So you then can easily discriminate between a bacterial infection and a non-bacterial infection, and that can help you to decide whether or not an antimicrobial therapy is needed. But I really see a huge future here and a huge potential for more cow or animal side testing. The main iron, that's a very small device. It's not it's operational, but I think it's still too expensive now. But you can compare it to a small PCR machine. But I think that in 10 years' time, it's really feasible for many veterinary practices to have it in their practice, to quickly have a diagnose and identify the causative organism. But also simple test. This, for instance, this is a small mastitis test, a rapid mastitis test, which discriminates between positive, gram-negative, and no growth, and that could really help a farmer make a clinical decision on whether or not an animal should be treated with antibiotics. Well, the fourth is replacement. We should replace antibiotics where possible. We see a huge increase in the use of pre and probiotics, homeopathy, phytotherapy, blah blah blah, on our farms. I find this a very difficult one because most of these products, they have no data behind them, so the evidence is often lacking. But some products, probiotics, prebiotics, they seem to work and to stabilize gut health, for instance. And maybe they have also like a placebo effect on the farmer. So we see a huge increase there of these kinds of products. Well, the fifth R is of review. As mentioned before, the farm health plan and farm treatment plan, we have to evaluate that at least once a year together with the farmer. We have to evaluate the antibiotic use together with the farmer at least every year. We have to do therapy evaluations. We have to visit the farms several times a year to inspect the animal health. Veterinary guidelines, they are regularly updated by the Veterinary Association. Also, the formularies are regularly updated. The SDA, so the Veterinary Medicines Institute, they regularly update their benchmark system and the antimicrobial use targets. So we do a lot of review, looking back, okay, what have we achieved and what's necessary for the upcoming period. Okay, what's the effect of this policy? That's the interesting one. Well, these are figures of sales data. We are already collecting sales data, national sales data since 1999. And then between 1999 and 2007, you hardly see a decrease in antimicrobial use, despite the fact that we have banned the use of antimicrobial growth promoters here. And it's still, well, it was almost 40% of the antimicrobial use in 1999 was growth promoters, and in 2006 that was 0. But still, the total antimicrobial use did not decrease very much. But then after 2009, 2010, when we introduced the strong policy, the strong reduction policy, we really saw a rapid decrease in the use of antimicrobials. And now we have achieved almost a 70% reduction in antimicrobial use. And we can also see it when we look to our benchmark systems. You can see this, the upper figure is of the antimicrobial use in broilers in 2012, and the distribution amongst the different categories of antimicrobial use. And here you saw that still a lot of farms were in the red zone, so in the action zone. But in 2019, so last year, most broiler farmers were below the 10 DDDA. So we really see a left shift. So most farms, they've accomplished to drastically reduce their use of antimicrobials. But reducing antimicrobial use is one thing. We are really interested in the effect on the resistance levels. But also there, since 1998, we are collecting structurally resistance data from indicator organisms. And here they're looking at resistance levels for E. coli, and especially in the broilers and in the pigs, we saw really a decline in resistance levels of indicator organisms. And that's where it was all about. That was our main objective, to reduce antimicrobial resistance levels. Okay, it is also interesting to look on what the effects were of this 70% reduction on animal production and animal health. And actually what you can see here on the left side, you see some tables of the main production parameters in pigs and in broilers. But what we see is that productivity was certainly not jeopardized. On the contrary, the productivity even increased. Often the feed conversion lowered, the mortality rates they lowered. So both productivity improved and animal health improved. Here on the right side, you see the Dutch average milk somatic cell count, which is an indication of the average udder health in the Netherlands of the dairy cows. And we also see that the udder health is improving. The milk somatic cell count is decreasing, despite the fact that we have almost reduced antimicrobial use there with 60%. So you can see that improving animal health can go hand in hand with a drastic reduction in antimicrobial use, and that it doesn't have to be at the cost of productivity and animal health. So according to us, what were critical success factors for this accomplishment? What we really felt is that public pressure was really a motivator and really started the whole process of policy change, mindset change of farmers and veterinarians. What we also felt what was important that was that all parties were involved, so not a top-down approach, but really a bottom-up approach for head together. It was the government who said, okay, this is the target, but it's up to you how to get there. So all the parties were involved and they supported the measures. The measures were in the end initiated by well-organized private animal production sectors and the Veterinary Association. And the implementation was by private sectors, reducing their production chain quality system, and the enforcement was done by the government. What really helped was our benchmarking system, so that the usage was fully transparent from all the individual farms and all the individual veterinarians. I saw from my own practice that many farmers were really motivated when they got their benchmark back, so their AMU reports, and they were looking, okay, how am I doing compared to last year? How am I doing compared to my colleagues? What can I do to further lower my antimicrobial use? Some really saw it as a gain. And what also helped is that we had an independent institution, so the Veterinary Medicine Institute, which was accepted by all the parties, so both the government and the private sectors. Some considerations. What we really see is a change in attitude of Dutch farmers regarding antimicrobials. And what we also see is that the use of antimicrobials as a management tool, like preventive use of antimicrobials, has been replaced by better biosecurity, by uptake of vaccinations, better herd health management supervised by veterinarians. We saw no negative effects in production or animal welfare, and well, our conclusion is that we have shown that reduction is really possible in a country with a very large and intensive livestock sector, a large exporter of agricultural products. I have 2 more slides. I'm almost there. We can discuss whether we have now achieved a 70% reduction. And now we can sit on our back and say, okay, we have done our share and this is it. But that's not how we are in the game now. Now we are looking, okay, we still see large differences. We still see some farms and some veterinarians that prescribe really much more than their colleagues. And we are now in several research projects, we are looking at, okay, what discriminates high users versus low users, or what discriminates high prescribers from low prescribers. And there we really involve also the social sciences, and we don't only look to technical aspects, but also to things like motivations, behavior change methodology. Those are the things we are looking after. So that's the process where we are in now. So focus on the high users, high prescribers to maybe even reach the 80% reduction. I think I leave it with this. And this picture is the reason why I'm still a practitioner. I mean, this is my working environment for 3 days a week, and I still love it. Thank you. Are there any questions?
Thank you very much, David. Thanks for bringing the Dutch context to us and to go through all these lessons learned. Really great presentation and really informative also. We do have a couple of questions. The first one would be from our colleague Valeria de Sá Jaime from the Veterinarian Zootech, Escola Veterinária e Zootecnia from the Federal University of Goiás. And she was asking about how do you manage to monitor or to do surveillance for the withdrawal periods in animal products such as dairy and meat?
Yeah, that's separate from this antimicrobial reduce policy, I think. Then you're talking about residues. We have legislation for that. I don't know for how long, for decades already. So we have a really good inspection, especially for milk, fresh milk, because a lot of it is processed to cheese and yogurt, etc. So there you cannot afford to have any residues in there. So every bulk milk is inspected for residues, and if residues are found, then the farmer, they get a penalty, and those are so high that a farmer is really motivated not to have any residue in this bulk milk. And the same is true for meat. And they cannot check every carcass, but they randomly select carcasses, check them for residues, and if they find residues, they go back to the farm and they get penalized.
Perfect, thank you. I think that another point that it's really important for the discussion, it's basically the use of antimicrobials in animal productions, especially because we often get the fingers pointed to animal productions, well, we also understand that we as veterinarians and also other professionals that are involved in the production chain, let's say, do have their responsibilities, our responsibilities to cope with. But if you could elaborate on your perspective of this, not say blame that the sector carries regarding the use or misuse or overuse of antimicrobials, I think that would be interesting.
And then you are being blamed by the human doctors, or?
Well, yeah, well, usually we get fingers pointed from the other sectors or even from the general population sometimes that we have been using, the animal health sector have been using too much, and especially when it comes to growth promoters, right?
Yeah, well, here in the beginning, in 2010, we were really finger pointed by the human doctors, and like, you are causing all the problems here. But on the other hand, it was for us a great driver to really do something about antimicrobial use. And now what we collaborated a lot with the human doctors as well. For instance, in my PhD, one of my supervisors, he is a human doctor. So we collaborated a lot, and now what we now see is that the human doctors, they were really how to say, they really looked at us, well, what have you achieved? So they were really wondering how we have managed to reduce so much in so little time spent. So now we are not being finger pointed at anymore, and we really collaborate together and join forces. And what helped within the sectors, we have a very good quality system, I think, and the livestock sectors, they are really well organized. So almost all farmers are a member of a certain quality system, and the government said, okay, what they did in 2010, they invited all the stakeholders to the table, so the livestock sectors, the veterinarians, and said, okay, it's your problem, the target is clear, 70% reduction, it's up to you to manage it. So that all the stakeholders were on board, so there was no need for them to finger point at the veterinarians or at the livestock sector, because we're together in this boat, and we had to travel together. So that really helped, I think.
Perfect, thank you. We got another question from Claudia Pimpão. So currently our food production models are in part sustained by the widespread prophylactic use of antibiotics, which results in the use of half of the antibiotics produced worldwide in the veterinary sector. The ethical issue of animal welfare is rarely addressed regarding the use of antibiotics. Your opinion about it?
Yeah, I agree. That's something we really should take in mind, the animal welfare aspect, because there's no need to let animals die because we are not treating them with antimicrobials. So what we really did in the Netherlands, we also kept a close eye on mortality rates, disease incidences, etc., etc. So it was not a standalone target, minus 70%, whatever it takes. And we also did have a close look at the animal welfare parameters. And what I hope I clearly showed is that the animal welfare and productivity was not deteriorated. I mean, the animal health indicators, they remain stable or even improved. Productivity improved. So that really showed that maybe all these preventive antimicrobial use practices were not definitely necessary, but it's more like an insurance. We are used to apply preventive antimicrobials already for decades, and so why bother? And now we have to carefully rethink, okay, is it really needed? And maybe we can do without. And of course that takes some trial and error to find out, okay, what's really necessary and what's not necessary. But we have learned a lot in 10 years time, and now I think we have managed to find a way in which we hardly use preventive therapies anymore and still are able to keep the animals healthy.
Okay, and I think that's a really interesting point also, because nowadays the fact that well, we get the European Union thinking about and discussing about imports bans from countries that are actually using and still using antimicrobials in animal productions, especially because of this concern regarding antimicrobial resistance and etc. So something that should be taken into consideration, and especially for countries like Brazil, for example, there is a big exporter of animal products, and many other countries that are still under development to continue these imports. So, David, I would like to thank you for your participation today, for your time, and for being here with us. It was a pleasure to have you, to listen to your talk and to have you with us. So, thanks a million. And let me check the time. So, we will have a 4-minute break, and then we will go to our next speaker. Bom, estamos de volta. I will introduce you our next speaker, Professor Will Gaze. Professor Will Gaze works on complex interactions within microbial populations in human, animal, and environmental microbiomes in the context of antimicrobial resistance. Current and recent research focus on evolution, dissemination, and transmission of antimicrobial resistance in natural and farm environments. He has been invited to speak on AMR on 5 continents in recent years and has advised the United Kingdom and overseas governments, including UNEP and WHO. So, well, please be welcome, and thanks for being here with us today. And the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. So I'll just try and share my screen. Let me see. Can you see my screen?
Yes.
Okay. I'm not sure if I can put it onto slideshow. Is that okay? Or does it disappear?
It appears, but it doesn't appear on the slideshow option.
Okay, I can. Let me just. How about that? Is that visible?
Yes, that works. Maybe you
okay.
Can zoom a little bit more.
You'll start cutting off the bottom of the slides.
Oh, yeah.
Is that okay?
Yeah.
Okay, well, thank you very much, and thank you for inviting me to speak to you today. So I will mainly focus on antimicrobial resistance in natural environments. I'll mention farmed environments a little bit because, of course, although antibiotics are used in animals and livestock production, the antibiotics are excreted by the animals, and the resistant bacteria are also excreted, where they enter the wider environment where they can either evolve or be transmitted back to humans. So I work at the University of Exeter Medical School in Cornwall, which is in the very far southwest of England by the sea. And I work in the medical school, but also in the Centre for Environment and Human Health and within the Environment and Sustainability Institute. So it's really at the interface between medical and environmental science. So really, there are three main issues that are associated with the environment in the context of antimicrobial resistance. And these are mentioned in both WHO and European Union action plans. And they are circulation of antimicrobial resistance in the environment or through the environment, the role of pharmaceuticals, so that's the antibiotics and other antimicrobials and heavy metals and other compounds, those compounds in the environment and how they might drive increased evolution of antimicrobial resistance. So that's the excretion from animals and humans that I mentioned before. About 70% of all antibiotics that are used are excreted by humans and animals. And then there's this environmental transmission. So if we're driving evolution of resistance in the wider environment and spread through fecal contamination, how is that transmitted, or is that transmitted back to people? There's a lot of debate about the importance of this, but there's increasing recognition that this is a really important part of thinking about antimicrobial resistance in this One Health context. So first of all, a little bit about microbial ecology. So really about bacteria in complex populations. So this is the number of bacteria on Earth, and it's 5 times 10 to the 30. And that's an enormous number. There's more bacterial biomass on Earth than there is in plants and animals, just that we can't see it, so we don't tend to think about it. And then there's this statistic here, which is that if every bacterium was a penny, you know, which is a small coin that we use in the UK, if every bacterium was a penny and you piled them on top of each other, so this is sort of an imaginary thing, then that stack of pennies would reach for 1 trillion light years. So this is actually trying to contextualize this huge number. It's really an unimaginable number. And then there are 5,000 species of bacteria in every gram of sediment or soil. And most of these, of course, we can't grow. So we have to use these molecular tools like sequencing and quantitative PCR to really understand what's going on in these populations of bacteria, rather than just focusing on the pathogens themselves. And we know that antibiotic resistance has been increasing in recent years. So this is from a paper by Charles Knapp, who's 10 years old now, but This is over time, so 1940 to 2000, and this is increased resistance in archived soil samples, so beta-lactamases, tetracyclines, genes that confer resistance to tetracyclines, genes that confer resistance to erythromycin, which is a macrolide. And we can see this resistance has increased over time, and this mirrors what's happened in the clinic in terms of resistance in infectious pathogens. And then we consider this also in terms of the antibiotic pipeline. So this is the development of new antibiotics over time. We can see that, you know, now compared to in the 60s and 70s, there are very few new antibiotics coming to market. So really it's this increasing resistance in the context of decreasing drug discovery. And I'm sure you've covered that already in this symposium. So antibiotic resistance is not a new thing. It's not really even arisen because of antibiotic usage by humans. We know that, for example, this slide is showing that if we look in permafrost, so that's, you know, frozen soil in very high latitude polar regions, we can find antibiotic resistant bacteria in the same strata as, you know, all of these extinct animals. So 30,000 years ago, if we look at sediment that was frozen 30,000 years ago, or soil rather, we can find bacteria that are resistant to current clinical antibiotics. And there are other examples of isolated cave systems that have been separated off from the rest of the world for millions of years. And we can isolate bacteria that have resistance to modern antibiotics. And this isn't really surprising given that antibiotics, most of our antibiotics are natural products that are produced by bacteria and fungi, and they've been producing those for millions, if not billions of years. So it's not new, but what we've done is really increase the level of selection for resistance. So there's new resistance through mutation, but these resistance genes that encode proteins or, you know, mechanisms of resistance in environmental bacteria, they can be mobilized to human pathogens, and I'll talk a bit more about that later. So again, you know, this is not something new, I'm sure, for you, but AMR arises because, for example, antibiotics exert a selective pressure on a population of bacteria where resistance may be quite rare, but over time, of course, that resistance increases to the point where now, you know, in the human gut, there's a very high level of resistance in many of our gut bacteria, and the same is true for in livestock that are antibiotics are used in their production. So antibiotic resistance can occur through mutation in genes in the chromosomal genes of bacteria. So that can happen de novo. That can happen in the clinic under antibiotic therapy. But we think more importantly is this phenomenon called horizontal gene transfer, which you may well have already discussed, and I'm sure many of you will know about. But briefly, there are several different mechanisms of horizontal gene transfer, or lateral gene transfer, it's sometimes called. And this can include transformation, where resistance genes or DNA can be released by bacteria, either actively through excretion or when the cell dies, and that DNA can be taken up by a recipient cell, and those resistance genes can be, in some cases, integrated into the genome and confer resistance. And then we have bacterial transduction, which is viruses that infect bacteria or phage. These mobilize resistance genes between bacteria. And then we have conjugation, which is probably most similar to sexual reproduction in higher organisms. And therefore, we think these plasmids and other genetic elements, mobile genetic elements that can carry resistance genes, can be mobilized between even unrelated bacteria, and that can then spread through populations very rapidly. Also, these plasmids can carry multiple resistance genes. So a bacterium can go from pan-susceptible to pan-resistant, in theory, in one evolutionary step. That's why that's so important. And this is an electron micrograph of two bacteria that are undergoing conjugation. And this slide really, it just says that there's two main reasons why we should be worried about this. One is this rare transfer, or presumably rare, where we get maybe environmental bacteria that have a new gene that's not in a clinical pathogen, and that can be mobilized into either a commensal bacterium, which can then in the human gut, which can then spread to pathogens, or direct spread to a pathogen. So this is about long-term evolution of resistance, that the environmental, what we call the microbiome or the resistome, is really important, but also this acute dissemination or acute transmission event. So this is where a person might be exposed to, say, contaminated water, and they contract they're infected by antimicrobial resistant pathogen that makes them ill at that point in time. So there's these short-term acute transmission events, but there's this long-term evolution of resistance that is also important. And of course, this is just showing that there are also antibiotics in different environments. And of course, bacteria produce antibiotics themselves, so that there are antibiotics present from producers, but also the excreted antibiotics from humans and animals, and indeed antibiotics that are used in crop protection, so that are used as pesticides in some parts of the world. That can also be an issue. And this is not presenting quite right because of the way that it's just presented. But I put this slide here just to show that this emergence of resistance from the environmental bacterial populations is a little bit like emergence of zoonotic pathogens from animals that then, wild animals that then can move to farm animals and then emerge in humans. This, for example, with SARS-CoV-2, with COVID-19, some people say that AMR is it's a pandemic as well. Of course, it's a slow motion pandemic, and I think there are analogies between the emergence of zoonotic pathogens and this emergence of antibiotic resistance from environmental bacteria. And this is one thing that actually in the WHO action plan, they talk about circulation of resistance through the environment, but they don't really talk about the origin of antibiotic resistance in the environment. And I think that's a really important point. And then so you can sort of summary this One Health sort of perspective, really simply, where we have food animals, we have bacteria in manure slurry and sewage sludge, which can be applied to land, in soil, in water, and then this is the human microbiome, and then all of the commensal bacteria and the pathogens that can be within human populations. And we see that there's opportunities for gene transfer between all these different compartments. And then in the pink or purple, this is selection. So, and all of these compartments, even in the environment, selection can occur. And there's a lot of research into whether there's very low levels of antibiotics in water, for example, in rivers or in soil that's had animal manures added to them. The question is, are those concentrations of antibiotics high enough to drive evolution of resistance? And I'll talk a bit more about that later on. So sometimes we see antimicrobial resistance summarized like this. So this is the UK Department of Health sort of systems map of AMR in animals and the environment. And it's very complicated, and sometimes when you look at this you just think it's just too complex to really deal with, but actually we can begin to break this down by the different environments. So the natural environment, humans, food producing animals, wildlife, for example, and then these different colored boxes, these brownie ones, that's influence on risk of infection, yellow influence on development of resistance. So I'm not going to go through this in detail, but this is the type of way that people have tried to think about this as a sort of a connected or unified problem. Some other people use more simplified versions of this, and this is widely used, and I've seen many people presenting this slide. So here we have the humans, we have animals, of course, and then we've got fish farming or aquaculture. So we've got the aquatic environment, we've got soil environments. Again, there's lots of these arrows. So the direction of the arrows is important, and also maybe the thickness of the arrow, if we're going to try and get some idea of relative importance of these different transmission routes and different environments where selection can occur. And it's only really in the last few years that people, maybe 10 years and maybe 5 years actually, where even more emphasis is placed on this One Health consideration of antimicrobial resistance. But actually, when I saw this slide, I saw that this was after Linton 1977, and I've managed to track down that original paper. And that was published by a group in Bristol University in 1977. And the title was Antibiotic Resistance, the Present Situation Reviewed. And actually in that paper is the simplified origin of that previous diagram I showed you. So actually, really, this is more or less the same as the current thinking about One Health. We have humans, people in hospitals, rural environments, so rural populations, urban populations. Here are our animals with sheep and cattle, cows, pigs, poultry. These black arrows show where you might get selection for resistance. So high selection in black and lower selection in white. And then we have the environment. So we've got rivers and streams and sewage and people swimming in the sea, slurry on pasture from animals. And, so it's really very similar. And what I've done, the only thing that I think that is different here, or our understanding now, nearly 50 years later, is that we know now that selection can occur within the natural environment. So I put these arrows in here. So in the animation, they appear later. But really, I think that this shows actually that nothing is really that new, and that our thinking it's been very slow to gain traction, this sort of One Health idea. But now it's firmly within all of our different country action plans and WHO and United Nations perspectives about AMU. So I gather that you've already had presentations on antimicrobial usage in livestock and animals and AMR in humans. So I will not talk about it in great length, but obviously it's a big issue. We have Staphylococcus aureus and methicillin-resistant Staphylococcus aureus, we know, can be in cattle and in pigs, and we have E. coli that can be resistant to really important clinical antibiotics that we find these on food. And now with the global trade in food, this is obviously important, but obviously the waste from farming goes into the natural environment, and then you get mixing of bacteria, environmental bacteria, bacteria from humans and from animals together in the presence of these selective chemicals, and that's a really important thing. So the World Health Organization has recommended that we try and reduce usage of antibiotics in animal production, but there's still a lot of debate and discussion around how important it is in terms of driving emergence of resistance in humans. And there was a systematic review carried out a couple of years ago for the WHO, which looked at the evidence for this. And basically they found that the antibiotic usage is associated with antibiotic resistance in bacteria within animals. And they found less evidence, but still some evidence that usage in animals is associated statistically with resistant infections in humans, but there was less evidence for that. And this is a huge area of research, and I'm sure you're aware of that, and I've covered that earlier. But one point to make, of course, is that even though the risk of transmission through the food chain or through the environment might be low, if you compare that to people within hospitals, so there may be a higher probability of transmission in hospitals, but a much smaller population compared to the global population that, eating food and interacting with the environment. So a large number of people exposed to a small risk may generate more cases than a small number of people exposed to a high risk. So we should always remember this, and it's sort of counterintuitive. We think maybe the problems should always be within hospitals, and of course antibiotic usage in hospitals is extremely important, but we also need to consider resistance in farming and also through pollution in the natural environment. So the United Nations Environment Programme covered that in 2017, 2018, and I actually wrote the Frontiers chapter on antibiotic resistance in the environment, and you can find that online. And they produced some of these diagrams. This is with a river, sort of showing how everything is linked together. You know, we can't think about antimicrobial resistance or antibiotic resistance just in terms of human medicine or just with animal usage. We have to think about it in this One Health sort of interconnected way. So now I'm going to talk briefly about some of our own research looking at antibiotic resistance in the environment. So firstly, this is about the dissemination or the spread of resistance through the environment, so through the landscape. And we've done this in several different ways, but we focus on bacteria, but we also focus on the mobile genetic elements, the MGEs, and also on the resistance genes themselves. So if they happen to be in these bacteria we can't grow easily, then we use molecular methods to study them at the genetic level. So we do that type of landscape scale environmental surveillance projects. We also work on evolution of resistance in the environment, so in situ selection by antibiotic residues and other co-selecting compounds such as disinfectants, biocides and metals, for example. And then we think about human exposure. So we cover these three different areas that map onto the WHO priorities. So this is a diagram from a collaborator of mine, Tong Zhang, who works in University of Hong Kong. And these are all the different resistance gene classes down the side. So tetracycline, sulfonamides, multi-drug resistance, chloramphenicol, beta-lactam resistance. And then these are different sewage sludge samples collected from the big sewage works in Hong Kong. And basically this shows you that these sewage sludge samples, they contain nearly all of the they contain all of the resistance genes that we're aware of, really, which is not surprising because they're in human feces. But it's what happens next, I suppose, that is the important thing. And this is from shotgun sequencing, where you sequence all of the DNA that you extract from a sample of sewage sludge in this case. So in the UK, we've done some work here. So this is a large sewage treatment works near where I used to work in the University of Warwick. And the discharge of the treated effluent is discharged into this small river here. So although the treatment removes quite large numbers of bacteria and chemicals, there still are resistant bacteria in that effluent. And in the UK, 11 billion litres of wastewater are discharged every day into rivers or the sea. But we tend to not really worry about it. We think, well, it's well treated, it should be fine. Of course, the same process will happen in places like Brazil, but in some cases there may be more raw sewage being discharged. We still discharge raw sewage into the environment, but usually after heavy rainfall, when the sewers they overflow, and then we get these, they're called combined sewage overflows. Anyway, so this is a graph which basically shows these are upstream samples from this here. So basically this discharges into the river somewhere here. So we sampled upstream of the plant and downstream of the plant. So this was 200 meters upstream, 400 meters and 600 meters upstream, 200 meters downstream, 400, 600 meters downstream. And this is the class 1 integrase. So it's a genetic element, or it's a gene that's associated with a genetic element that can integrate nearly all known antibiotic resistance genes. And we can see here that the prevalence is much higher downstream than upstream. It looks quite low, but remember this is only 1%, but this is 1% of all bacteria. So if you've got 1 billion bacteria per gram, 1% of that is still a very a very large number. And then we did this on a whole river catchment. So we did it with, this is with my colleagues at the Centre of Ecology and Hydrology, Andrew Singer, in Oxford. And they study the River Thames. So this is a map of the River Thames, which is, of course, the really big river that runs through central London. But we sampled multiple samples within this river. And this is the data for that same marker of resistance, the class 1 integrase, at different sites. And we can see that sometimes they're very low. So this was 4 repeated samplings over 2 years, I think. And then sometimes they're always high. So we did some very simple statistical modeling. And for each sample site, this is the sample site here in the blue triangle. We looked at these are the sewage treatment plants that are upstream. So basically we measured the distance to the plant, the size of the plant in terms of the number of people that it served, and the type, whether it's secondary or tertiary treatment. And when we did some statistical analysis or regression analysis, we could actually see that we could predict the integron prevalence very accurately. Actually, we could account for about 80% of the variation in integron prevalence, and the main drivers were distance from, type of, and size of wastewater treatment plant, and that accounted for about 50% of the variance, and 30% was associated with diffuse pollution. So this is probably coming from agricultural fields, land, you know, where either there are grazing animals or there's manure or sewage sludge applied to land. And then more recently, we've done some work which isn't published yet, but this is looking in that same River Thames catchment, but sequencing samples. So basically, we see that this is macrolide resistance genes, fluoroquinolone, tetracyclines, aminoglycosides, peptide antibiotic resistance genes, glycopeptides. So basically, all of the range of resistance genes you can think of, we can find within the sediment of the rivers. And again, the levels correlate with the point and diffuse pollution sources, which are wastewater treatment from human wastewater, and also runoff from agricultural land. So then we study the spread and why we find elevated or increased levels of resistant bacteria or resistance genes in the environment. But then we also try and look at the interaction between the antibiotic residues that we know are there, which are usually in this nanogram to microgram per liter. So, you know, much lower than the concentration that would be used to treat infection. And we also look at other things like biocides. This is a figure from the Frontiers United Nations document, just talking about co-selection with metals and biocides. They can be carried, of course, the resistance genes can be carried on the same plasmids. So it's not only antibiotic pollution that can be selecting for antibiotic resistance, it's maybe other things like detergents and antiseptics. So we also we consider what the levels of antibiotics are in the environment, and often they're, as I said before, they're in this low microgram per liter or high nanogram per liter. But in hospital wastewater, they can be considerably higher than that. And then in animal manures and sewage sludge, for example, we can see milligram per kilogram or milligram per liter. This is in liquid manures, so 60 milligram per liter. You're getting up into that clinical treatment concentration levels there. So other people in the field have, and particularly this group in Sweden, which is this paper by Gullberg et al. Have suggested that as well as this minimum inhibitory concentration, which we think about in terms of what's the concentration of antibiotic that stops growth or kills bacteria, so the MIC, there's also this other value, which is the minimal selective concentration. And you can see here that this is the MIC of a susceptible and an MIC of a resistant bacterium. So obviously you're going to get selection for the resistant one here, but even below this threshold, you see that actually the resistant bacterium grows faster than the susceptible one, even though the susceptible one is still alive, but it's growing slower. So it basically, the resistant ones outnumber the susceptible ones within this window. And where these two growth rates cross here, this is the minimal selective concentration. So what they do is they grow bacteria, resistant and susceptible bacteria, that are identical, apart from one is resistant, one is susceptible, and they grow those bacteria at a range of antibiotic concentrations, and then they can actually work out what is the lowest concentration where we see this sort of similar growth rate, and it's where it crosses the x-axis. And in this case, for tetracycline, we can see it's about 15 nanogram per microliter, so it's about 15 micrograms per liter, and that's 100-fold lower than the minimum inhibitory concentration. And the same group have done this for other antibiotics, and for things like fluoroquinolones, such as ciprofloxacin, the selective concentration, the minimal selective concentration, can be as low as 100 nanograms per liter, and actually this is, you know, lower than concentrations found in the natural environment, say in river water, in many cases. Of course, that varies depending on how polluted the natural environment is. So far that's been done in single species, but what we've tried to do is do these experiments in complex communities of bacteria, which are more representative of what goes on in the real world, although we still do this at high nutrient and high temperature, so we can get a large number of generations of the bacteria. So these are sort of what people call experimental evolution experiments. So every day we inoculate multiple different concentrations of antibiotics in media, and we passage that every day for a week. So we see about 50 generations of this complex community. In this case, we use raw sewage as the sort of human associated gut flora. And what we see is over time is that this is in the light grey bars is at the beginning of the experiment, and the black bars are at the end of the experiment. And this is the prevalence of the resistance genes we're looking at as a marker for that particular antibiotic. In many cases, we use that same class 1 integrase as a marker. So in this instance, in this assay, we see that cefotaxime, the lowest selective concentration is about 125 microgram per liter. Chloramphenicol, it's about 500, gentamicin about 250, and trimethoprim about 60. These are a bit higher than we find in natural environments, apart from the very heavily polluted ones. But we know that this is likely to be an underestimate of effects, because these are quite noisy experiments with many different species that are competing, and they're not maybe as accurate as these single species experiments that have been done with fluorescent protein tagged strains, which are then counted using a flow cytometer. These prevalences are derived using quantitative PCR. But in any case, when we do the risk assessment, so we can perform risk assessment with these minimal selective concentrations. So we work out a risk quotient, which is the RQ, which is the probable no effect concentration, which is that minimal selective concentration with a safety margin added. So this is routinely used for risk assessment, and then that's divided by the measured environmental concentrations, either the maximum or the median. So the red triangles is where there's a high risk of selection at the maximum concentrations in the environment, and we can see ciprofloxacin, cefotaxime, and trimethoprim all show that they're looking like they may be selective at in these heavily polluted sites. But also we do see that for these open triangles, for example, ciprofloxacin, that looks like this is selective at the median measured environmental concentration. So really the take-home message is that it's not all antibiotics that are likely to be selective at low concentration. It's very class specific. So this is actually sort of the overall measure of how potent or how selective they are. And you can see that macrolide antibiotics are less potent than others. But then again, if the measured environmental concentrations are high, they can still be a risk. So more recent research, again with my colleague Andrew Singer at the Centre of Ecology and Hydrology and another colleague at University of Warwick, Liz Wellington, we've been trying to do this work actually in rivers. So rather than in the test tube, we're actually adding antibiotics to these what we call flumes, which are channels where the water enters at this end, and there's a flow gate here so we can regulate the flow, and then we pump in antibiotics through this tubing, and then at the other end are ceramic tiles where we get biofilms of bacteria growing, and basically that then allows us to ask whether these low levels of concentrations of antibiotics in rivers are also driving evolution of resistance. So the final section is basically then on to people say, well, why does it matter if there are resistant bacteria in the environment? Well, we know we use river water for irrigation, we use wastewater recycled in very arid areas for irrigation, we dispose of our own waste into the environment, you know, either onto soils or into rivers. Animal waste goes into the environment. So there is potential for transmission back to humans. And we did a study in the UK where we looked in coastal waters around England and Wales. So we sampled roughly about 100 different bathing beaches where people go swimming on the coast. Very similar in Brazil. You know, big surfing communities, lots of people swimming. And we isolated E. coli, working with the UK Environment Agency, and we worked out the number of E. coli carrying particular antibiotic resistance genes. So in this case, CTXM genes, which is a extended spectrum beta-lactamase gene that confers resistance to third generation cephalosporins. And what we could see was that in really high water quality, so this is the guideline water quality, so below 250 E. coli per 100 mils, the risk was low, but as the water quality decreased, the actual number of resistant bacteria ingested by individuals increased. And we estimated that for the whole of England and Wales, this was equivalent to about 6 million exposure events per year. So again, the risk of transmission may be very low, but a lot of people, or there's a lot of exposures. So this only tells us about exposure. So then we wanted to understand about transmission, and this is my colleague Anne Leonard. So she did this study where we looked at surfers. So we took rectal swabs from a cohort of surfers that are frequently exposed to coastal water, and then we had a comparison group with 150 controls. And what we found out was that in actual fact, when we looked at this carriage of cefotaxime resistant E. coli, there was a 4 times higher probability that surfers carried these bacteria in their gut contents, and about I think it's about 3 times. 3 times here for cefotaxime resistant E. coli, and 4 times higher risk of actually carrying CTXM resistance. So we characterized the genes that were conferring resistance, and many of them were CTXMs. Some were CTXM15, which is the important CTXM in human infections in the UK, and quite a few of the surfers were carrying E. coli strain sequence type 131, which is one of the epidemic pathogenic strains. So this doesn't tell you about infection, but it does tell you about transmission in terms of colonization, which we know is a risk factor for infection. So in summary, we know that human and animal associated resistant bacteria are introduced into the environment where they mix with indigenous environmental bacteria in the presence of antibiotics and other pollutants. We know that these levels of resistance are quite predictable at a whole river catchment scale. We also know that there is evidence of selection or evolution of antibiotic resistance at environmental concentrations for some antibiotics. We know that humans are exposed to AMR bacteria in natural environments, And we also know that there is a risk of transmission, or at least an association with increased gut carriage in highly exposed groups. We also know that colonization is a risk factor for infection. But what we still don't really know, and people always ask, is, well, of all of those infections that are making people ill and killing people in the clinic, how many of those are directly attributable to environmental transmission? And because, as I explained before, there is this long-term emergence of resistance coming from environmental bacteria, like emergence of zoonotic pathogens, and also the acute transmission events. This is very hard to answer, particularly when you think about the numbers of bacteria there are, the diversity of bacteria there are in the environment, and the difficulty of studying resistance at this genetic level. So it's not necessarily even, you know, people can have an infection caused by a human strain of bacteria, but where did the genes come from on the plasmids? It's very hard to tell that, even from whole genome sequencing, unless you use these long read new methods. So what can we do? Well, we can reduce antibiotic usage, we can improve our waste management. We need to continue to increase the evidence base around these environmental reservoirs, because that's what regulators and policymakers want. We need to generate more data on risks of evolution of resistance in these polluted environments. We need more data on the human risk assessment in terms of exposure and transmission. And then we also need to think about how effective, you know, what's the cost benefit in terms of the different mitigation strategies. Some are very expensive, like installing ozonation equipment to almost sterilize wastewater before discharge into the environment. Really hugely expensive. But we also know that even relatively simple wastewater treatment can reduce dissemination of AMR into the wider environment. And if you're interested in this area, there's a report that was published, I think, in 2019, 2019, which was the output of this International Environmental AMR Forum. And I was a member of this, and there's a large white paper. So if you just, I haven't got the link, unfortunately, but if you just type into Google International AMR Forum, and then there's the US Center for Disease Control and the Wellcome Trust, you'll find that document. And this really goes into talking about manufacturing waste, so pharmaceutical manufacturing waste, which I haven't touched on today, where antibiotics are made, and then you get pollution associated with that. And then livestock associated AMR, human associated AMR from human waste, and also antibiotics used as pesticides in plant production. So it's a really nice overview for you there. And this is just the people in my group that have contributed to the talk that I've given today, and my collaborators in other universities. And then these are some of the organizations that have funded our research. So thank you very much. So I'll stop sharing my screen now.
Thanks a lot, Will, for this great presentation. It was really informative, and I keep getting I don't know why, but I keep getting shocked with some outputs that we get from the environmental research, because sometimes it's really shocking for us. And one of my favorite examples is the surfers, that sometimes we even take that into consideration, just by the simple fact that they drink more seawater than
that's right.
So it's really it's impressive. And so today I've started the opening remarks by bringing up this correlation between this three specific words that will be dilution, pollution, and solution. And also taking into consideration these interactions between the resistant bacteria and humans, animals, especially wildlife, that we also get a lot of studies that from wild animals that were never exposed to treatments, but they do carry, or it's possible to identify resistant bacteria. And even going to the aquaculture context, where we do have aquaculture productions in open waters, or even farmed, fish farms and etc.
Yeah.
So it's I think it will be interesting to get your perspective on this three words. Pollution, and solution, because if they the things that once we manage them in the sentence, they mean completely different things. So I think it would be interesting to get your perspective on that.
Yeah, no, thanks. A lot of people say that the solution to pollution is dilution, and I think clearly what this shows is that that is not always the case, because if we see that antibiotics that are diluted as they go into rivers are still at concentrations that are sufficient to drive evolution of resistance, then that solution to getting rid of our waste, which is what generates the pollution, it's not a complete solution. So I think it's always about, it's not about dilution, it's about how dilute. So this is about working out what are the thresholds for dilution that reduces those antibiotics or other compounds down to a safe level, that because you can never probably remove them completely, but it's about reducing the risk or reducing the drivers of evolution resistance. So actually I was at a meeting recently where I used the same sentence, but I said it's not the solution to pollution necessarily, because the more we find out, the more we find that these low concentrations are still doing something, they're still active. And in terms of being, exposed to resistant bacteria, how many bacteria do you need to ingest in order for that to, your gut to be colonized? It may not be very many. So even though wastewater treatment in the UK can reduce 99% of bacteria or remove 99.9% of bacteria, that sounds a huge number, but if you start off with hundreds of millions per litre, 99% or 1% of 100 million is still a large number. So I think that dilution is not always sufficient. In terms of wildlife, it is intriguing, and we've done some work looking at populations of small mammals like mice and shrews that forage near rivers, like on the edge of a river, and then with matched control populations inland, and they have very different levels of resistance in their gut. So the small mammals, the mice that are foraging on the river, the littoral zone of the river, they have much higher levels of resistance, presumably because the water is carrying resistant E. coli from human feces. So, but I think we know now that that birds like seagulls and geese, they can carry resistance. So seagulls, I'm not sure what the name that you give to them, but there's large coastal birds, and they often forage in sewage, and and some of them can migrate between continents even. So they're mobile, they're moving around on huge distances, thousands of miles potentially, some wildlife. So I think that's it. There's so much resistance out there now in terms of pollution that it's got everywhere, even into these environments we think are quite pristine or quite clean. So of course we'll always find resistance, because there is this naturally occurring resistance. So it's identifying which markers show pollution from human or animal sources relative to that natural indigenous level of resistance. So this is where not all resistance is the same. But aquaculture again is a good example, because high concentrations of antibiotics are used and added directly into water, for example, in some cases. So even though globally, the amount of antibiotics used in aquaculture may be not as high as in pig farming or poultry production, we add those antibiotics directly into the water. So they're more likely to be selecting in the natural environment than, say, antibiotics that are used in intensive pig farming. Although, having said that, a large proportion ends up being excreted in the feces and then goes back into the soil. So it's a very complex picture.
Thank you very much. And in that, we forget that once we are treating a fish, we are not treating a fish, we are treating all of them that are in the same environment. We cannot segregate that, unfortunately.
That's right.
Regarding the engagement of the environmental sector in the context of antimicrobial resistance, of course, sometimes it's mostly in a good part of the areas that are covered under the One Health concept. So if we were to focus on activities for antimicrobial resistance for research, for example, or whatever you think it's suits in that, to focus on specific topics for the environment, what would you prioritize?
Yeah, so I've been working quite closely now with the Environment Agency in England and Wales, and with the Department of Environment, Food and Rural Affairs. So the Ministry of Agriculture, which is what it used to be called. And I think that they are most convinced by studies like the human transmission studies. So where you can demonstrate that people are actually being exposed to resistant bacteria, or even the fact that they are more likely to be colonized or infected, because ultimately that shows the impact on human health. But also this interaction between antibiotic and other antimicrobial pollutants and the bacteria in the environment, I think is also a growing awareness that this is important. And we have regulations through the European Union called the Water Framework Directive, and that considers pollutants that are toxic to aquatic life, but of course antibiotics are not necessarily toxic to aquatic life, but they may be exerting this selective pressure. So we've spent a long time building up relationships between these different with these policy and regulatory groups, and over time they really are beginning to realize that it is an important issue, but it takes a long time, and you have to start, I guess you've got to start with simple messaging around transmission and selection, driving increased level of resistance or emergence of new resistance. And I think actually the COVID-19 pandemic is a useful comparator to make, because everybody now knows that viruses can come from bats and then they go into farm animals and then to humans. So if you make that comparison with resistance genes that can come from environmental bacteria into animal associated bacteria then to humans, I think that maybe allows what is a quite abstract concept for non-microbiologists to be understood. So I think focus on transmission and then on the pollution and how that might be driving resistance, and then remind them about the similarities to COVID-19, and they're almost like a type of emerging zoonotic, not infection, because the resistance doesn't cause infection, but it's the resistance that can be moved from non-pathogenic bacteria to pathogenic bacteria. So this whole idea of horizontal gene transfer is really difficult to get across in a simple way, I think, to policymakers. Oh, I can't hear you now.
Forgot to unmute. But perfect. Thanks, Will. And so I just would like to thank you for being with us today, for the great presentation, and for your participation in the event. And just big thanks in the name of the organization team and from the One Health Commission too. And with that said, I think we are closing this module for today, and that's it.
Okay.
So, thank you
very much. And I'm happy to, if anyone's got any questions, they'd like to just email me. If you have my email address, I'll be happy to discuss with anybody if they've got any further questions.
Perfect. We will be able to share with the participants by email well, once we send well, the certificates, for example, we will definitely make it available. Well, thanks, Will. And, bom, pessoal, muito obrigada pela participação no módulo de hoje. Assim vamos encerrar o módulo e a gente continua na sequência às 14 horas hoje à tarde. Muito obrigada.